We can start.
Good afternoon, friends. Welcome to the inaugural session of the anniversary meeting for 2020. We start on a very sad note that we have lost one of our most respected colleague, Professor Nasima. And I will read a request the President of INSA, Professor Chandrima Shahs, to give you the obituary message.
We are really broken to hear about the death of Sir Nasima. I will read a brief note about it. Professor Nasima received his PhD from California Institute of Technology, and he held various positions at the Indian Institute of Science, Bangalore, including chairman of the Department of Aerospace Engineering. He founded the Center for Atmospheric Sciences at INSA and headed it till 1989.
Your voice is breaking, madam.
Voice is breaking. I think the internet connection, maybe it's
Okay.
to connect it with. Can you read in because my voice is breaking? Can you read it, Professor Singhvi? The remaining. Can you hear me?
I can read.
Can you hear me, Professor Singhvi?
Yeah, I can hear
you properly.
Do I?
No, we can hear you properly.
I'm saying that. Now you can hear me? Yes. Okay, he founded the Atmospheric Sciences at IISc and headed it till 1989. He was director of the National Aerospace Laboratories and of the National Institute of Advanced Studies, Bangalore. And Professor Narasimha was chairman of Engineering Mechanics Unit at the Gen CSAR. And he served on the Scientific Advisory Committee to the Cabinet, Space Commission, Earth Commission, and the International Union of Theoretical and Applied Mechanics in various capacities. Professor Narasimha's research mainly dealt with aerospace, space fluid dynamics and various flow problems, atmospheric dynamics. He made extensive studies of transitions between laminar and tubular, the structure of shock waves, various characteristics of fully developed turbulent flow, the fluid dynamics of clouds, near surface temperature distributions of eddy fluxes in atmospheric boundary layers, and the nonlinear vibration of elastic strings. Professor Narasimha was conferred the Shanti Prize, Padma Bhushan and Padma Vibhushan. He was elected of the Royal Society, the American Institute of Aeronautics and Astronautics, Foreign Associate of the U.S. National Academy of Engineering and U.S. National Academy of Sciences. We may observe a minute of silence in his memory. Thank you. Start, Professor Singhvi.
Okay. Friends, can you hear me now?
Yes, we can hear you.
Yes. Friends, welcome to the anniversary meeting. And as you would have noticed, last few years, we have been discussing various aspects of science and technology for India's tomorrow. And we have been hosting symposiums on themes that inform policies and new science paradigms. We held in the last 2-3 years symposiums on a space program, future science at CSIR, food security, artificial intelligence, water futures, ethics, drug discovery, future science, sustainable energy, black hole physics, mathematics and society, biodiversity issues, future of healthcare, and ethical and scientific dimensions of rare diseases. Now, these were essentially aimed to produce white papers, and I will talk about them. The symposium this year has a presidential lecture which will follow very soon on host-pathogen relationship. We have a mini symposium through the talks of Professor Mehta, Raghavan, and Ashutosh Sharma, and they will deal with science, scientists, academies, future choices, next millennium, and policies. You have an excellent symposium tomorrow on human health and disease, the lessons from genomic studies, organized by Professor Partha Majumdar. And we have 3 international experts, including one from WHO, speaking on this symposiums. One Indian colleague will also speak. We have a symposium on cybersecurity in digital age, and this will be introduced by Professor Maninder Agarwal with colleagues from IIT Kanpur, IIT Kharagpur, and an advocate from Supreme Court of India. And then we have a symposium on gender issues in science with a very powerful lineup being led by Dr. Shobna Sharma. Yesterday, we had heard an evening lecture by Dr. Sunita Narayan on various aspects, aspects of climate risks. And you already received this booklet. Originally, we had planned that the symposium will be held at CSIR IICT Hyderabad, courtesy Dr. Shekhar Mande and Dr. Chandrasekhar. All the arrangements were made, but unfortunately, we had to cancel it due to COVID. But I hope that we can take up their invitation sometimes in the future. Now, based on these symposias, which were essentially kind of white papers informing policy, we have been able to publish a large number of books from INSA. And those which are in bold are the books which have statements on the policies for the government. Ethics in science, water futures, drug discovery, biodiversity, floods in rivers. And very next, in a few weeks' time, we'll have a book authored by Dr. Mehra, a white paper on host immunity and COVID-19 vaccine. There are a few others which are in the pipeline, and we would have about 24 books in the last 3 years being produced by INSA. One of the initiatives which was led by the president was to have books on impact of climate change. And this 2 books already have been commissioned, and they're expected in March and July. One is on impact of climate change on coastal ecosystems and impact of climate change on food chain. And I hope this will continue. There's also a book on plastic surgery being planned by one of the young scientists, a body of INSA, and it is in the state of review. It will be a textbook of about 1,000+ pages, 1,500 pages. We also had public lectures during the anniversary meetings, and we had invited people outside the science domain at times wherever possible. We had a lecture by Professor A.V. Ramarao on the journey of scientists as a scientist, as a technologist, an entrepreneur. We had Professor Sienna Rao speaking on excellence. We had Dr. Ramakrishna speaking on science of business and business of science. He was the head of innovations with the Tatas and earlier with Hindustan Lever. Yesterday, we heard a talk from a social scientist and a scientist on the science of climate risk world. And we'll have this evening a talk by Dr. Ashutosh Sharma. Very soon, we'll have a webinar series and a discussion forum created on the INSA virtual platform. And these will be held on a fixed days of month, so you can mark your calendars appropriately. Now, if you look at I'll slightly digress and try to share some of my thoughts. If we look at the models of academies, we have Royal Society, which is totally autonomous, independent, but whatever he says is the gold standard. The US Academy of Sciences actively participate in policy, and it really creates a large number of white papers, and they have links with the various senators. Every senator has a scientist link with them. The Chinese Academy is essentially government mandated. The INSA model is somewhere between the Royal Society and US Academy. Now, the question is, what is the role of INSA in its fellowships? Is it only to elect fellows, young scientists, and inspire fellows, and occasionally represent India as international science for us, or a bit more? Do we have a stated vision as an academy to inform the science, education, innovation trajectory of the country? Surely we have done very well in the past. We have produced excellent reports and guidelines like animal ethics and other things. But should we be doing more is a question that we need to understand. How much do we engage with the academy to enhance its activity? And I was slightly disturbed yesterday that there was a discussion of the time component of the fellows spending on academy. To me, academy allows us to paint on a national canvas in an interdisciplinary manner beyond our small science that we do in our labs. And I think this is a great opportunity that academy provides us to encash on and to impact upon the long-term future of the science and the nation itself. So how much of the time we should have for the academy work is for us to decide. There's a question of introspection that we did not have a formal role in the national education policy, nor we have a formal role in the STI policy. We did not have a formal role in pandemic science and mitigation, although many fellows have participated, but INSA per se, though we had volunteered several names for various things, but we did not have a role there. We do not have a formal role in climate change mitigation strategies. Yes, we have produced few white papers to benchmark, but we need to be continuously producing these white papers to benchmark the issues and a scientific stand based on this by our community. I may want to mention that our local chapters use less than 10% of the fund, virtually no activity at most places. Our remote area lectures, I had hoped and I had promised Professor Su that I'll go to 1,000, but with all the efforts, we only got 50 lectures in the last years. And our role in the international arena is slightly going down, as seen by the number of TWAS fellowship Indians are getting now. So INSA should be a platform to create new interdisciplinary paradigms and educational possibilities, develop out-of-box synthesis based on blueprints and to aid policies. Of course, scientific policies require many other things, but we should be able to state the scientific point of view and the evidence that is available as a white paper. We should be able to develop national vision and international mentorship for less developed countries as a part of science diplomacy. This is an area we have really not touched at, and I think INSA can play a key role in India's scientific diplomacy, and a Humboldt Fellowship or the Fulbright Fellowship are great models to look at. I believe that fellowship affairs and other affairs which we are doing now should occupy only 20% of the INSA's activity. The remaining should be brainstorming sessions, new ideas, new paradigms. And if we took at 10% of the time of each fellows at a 50% success rate, we are looking at 0.2 million scientist hours per year. And that much science with such a bright fellowship can do wonders for the country. The areas of concern for the country are the present rate of change. We had industrial revolution which went for 300 years, IT which went for 30, 40 years. Now artificial intelligence and IoT are happening by the minute. And how does the man of the street would understand and cope up with? What are our strategies? Future of jobs is another area we need to worry, and I'll come to it later a bit. We have a very low education base. Our education, as was mentioned yesterday by Professor Tarun Kant, is really bad, and that implies that the minds can be hacked, the society can be hacked. We are living in the best and the worst possible time. We have the best technologies, but every country has two countries in it. One is web enabled and other is not enabled. And approximately 10% is what is in India is web enabled. We need to worry about that part. I mean, I'll come to it in a minute. We are connected and disconnected. We are connected on the internet, disconnected socially, and it is creating a huge problem in the society. We need to worry about it. Fake news, again, an area need to be worried about. And the ethical aspect of biological interventions, genomics to cryobiological engineers. We have to look at it in detail so that India is prepared for such eventualities when they come to India in a big manner. There are issues of jobs due to artificial intelligence and the estimates suggest that approximately 10 crore people will need to be reskilled in the next 10 years. Job-induced migration is happening, that we have more industries coming in the south, more graduates are being produced in the north, and this means there is a migration from the north to south for jobs. Stresses and national imbalance that has to be looked into by us. Climate-induced migration will occur. It's going to happen very soon, and their ecological aspect. When you move billions of people from one place to other, how do you sustain them? What are the plans we should have? Where are the areas we can put them? Employments for millions of graduates, which will be coming out through a national education policy. What are the alternative skills can we think of? Web access I've talked about, but I will not be surprised that 10 years from now, people would ask for reservation because they did not have web access, because they did not have resources to access web. So again, there are two nations in one nation, and we may be thinking of web enability being an impediment for growth because 90% of people are outside the web circuit. Future of innovation, we talk about it. Innovation is a very beaten down word, but where is the ecosystem for innovation? And I think we need to create this ecosystem. We did try with the initiative of Professor Sood, something, but it has not taken off because not many people were interested in taking it forward. Education, we heard yesterday from Professor Tarun Kant, how do we reach out, how do we evaluate the efforts by the government? And more importantly, that we are technologically safe. Every instrument that we use in our labs, every computer is imported either from China, and if China stops supplying us computers, we are done with. And I think that's an important part to have it. These are some large number of jobs which have been will be lost. Here, healthcare, insurance, all these jobs will be lost, and most of the jobs will be based on virtual world. And there, we are not going to succeed because 90% of people are not even having web access. We talk about corporate social responsibility, but we need to talk about the social responsibility of an academic and the social responsibility of academies. I think these are important things we are not bothered about, and we need to be thinking about it. So we need to produce more white papers, support for meetings for groups, and artwork is now possible thanks to the presidents. They give money to for such activities. In 6 or 8 months, what is expected that you can produce a white paper, a synthesis document. And we need to have 1 per month white paper coming at least. We have right now managed on an average 8 per year. That has to increase. And of course, we have to strengthen outreach and capacity building efforts irrespective. And these are needed to be able to state our ideas, synthesis on policy and all aspects of science and society. And as Vikram Sarabhai said, to gain respect, we need to assume responsibility. And I will remind that quotation many times. Finally, I'll end with saying that ethics is a concern for entire society and its well-being. It's our social responsibility to use scientists to impact the lives of better in whatever manner we can do. And I'll end by saying a quote from Nietzsche: the future influences the present just as much as the past. Your anticipation about future would essentially decide your decisions at the present. Thank you so much. And I will now have the pleasure to welcome Professor, the President, Professor Chandrima Saha, and give a very brief introduction as instructed by her. She wanted no introduction, but I thought it's appropriate that we give a small introduction. Professor Chandrima Saha is a well-known biologist and the first women president of the Indian National Science Academy. And she took over in this year. She was the former director of the National Institute of Immunology, New Delhi, where she is currently serving as a national professor of eminence. Her work has been on the cell death processes and how they contribute to survival. She is a fellow of the World Academy of Sciences, fellow of all the 3 academies in India, and has numerous awards, including the Shanti Sarup Bhatnagar Award. I will not embarrass her by listing all the awards she has received, but there are about more than 10 awards there. She is currently a member of the Board of Trustees of DBT Wellcome Trust India Alliance, and then many other governing boards. My pleasure and honor to invite the president for her talk.
Thank you very much, Professor Singhvi. Can I now share my screen? Welcome to everyone to this meeting. And share. So, what happened? Sharing my screen. Yes, I'm sharing my screen. Can you see my screen? Is my screen visible? But I can't
It is
see.
visible, but
It is visible.
possibly not full screen.
Yes, it is visible. And you can make a
Yeah.
full screen.
Now,
No,
I
now.
can make a full screen now.
Yes.
Fine.
Now it's
It's-
yes. Now it's full screen. Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much, Professor Singhvi, for the kind introduction. And we are meeting at very extraordinary times when some idea of immunity is floating in our minds, and our discussions often border around flattening of the curve, the virus, the vaccine, etc., etc. So I thought to start this talk with a brief introduction about the immune system, and then go into some examples how host and pathogens interact with some examples from our work. Now, I made this talk a little easy for because scientists from various backgrounds are there, so I made it a little lucid, and I apologize to the experts. Now, pathogens that affect us actually attacks the very system that defends, that helps us to defend ourselves against them. Now, for about 200,000 years, during this time, the immune system has evolved with all the viruses and other bacteria and other pathogens infecting us. And so the question now is whether the immune system will keep the upper hand. Now, the good news is that we think that it will keep the upper hand, but the bad news is that it is not enjoying the luxury of time. So I will attempt to go through a bit of work that we have done, and parallels can be drawn with other systems as well. So about the immune system, when we receive our complete blood count report from the pathology laboratories, what we see is these cells that are neutrophils, lymphocytes, monocytes, eosinophils, and basophils. Basically, you are looking at the health of your immune system, because if there is a change in the numbers, it can reflect a disease state. So if our immune system has 2 components. One is the innate immune system and the other is the adaptive immune system. So the innate immune system is actually the first response to a pathogen, and it is non-specific and rapid, and it consists of cells that I mentioned here about eosinophils, basophils, monocytes, etc. You can see all these cells here, but the most important cells are the neutrophils, who are the first cells to go and kill the pathogens, then the macrophage and the dendritic cells, which acts as a bridge between the 2 systems. The adaptive system is actually starts working about a week after the infection. It's highly specific, and where the T cells are actually activating the B cells, and B cells are producing the antibodies. So this is a very complicated system, but our immunity has many facets. So it is complex, and it has evolved over the years to be complex, and so the human race can be saved, and there are very simple immune systems which exist in nature. Now, many years ago, that is in the late 1800s, Russian scientist Eli Mechnikov actually used starfish larvae, where he stuck a thorn in the starfish and the cells homed in there. So this was the first demonstration of inflammation, and then he named it as the first immune reaction. And now, if you look at the when pathogen actually enters our body, in the blood pool that is formed, the neutrophils are rushing there. And if you look at the different cell types, the neutrophils who migrate to infection kill the pathogen by factors. But not always it is successful. Sometimes the pathogens stay, and that's why we get the disease. So the monocytes and macrophages are also phagocytic cells. Macrophages are found in tissues where monocytes differentiate into macrophages that can engulf and enzymatically break down microorganisms and foreign material, and also present antigens to T cells. Now, dendritic cells can serve as sentinel function by engulfing cells material, breaking it down, and displaying the components on their cell surface presenting to the T cells. The presentation to the T cells is the most important event in immunity. So what happens when a pathogen encounters a neutrophil or a macrophage is that it is engulfed because the macrophage or the neutrophil recognizes some molecular patterns on the surface of the pathogens, and they are engulfed. They go into like the phagosome, which eventually fuses with the lysosome and degrades the pathogens. Why? The lysosome has low pH from 4 to 5. So that in itself is detrimental for the pathogen. And it has also lytic enzymes. And most importantly, it has the NADPH oxidase, which is an enzyme which actually produces the reactive oxygen species. So given, the reactive oxygen species are the most detrimental for the pathogens, it's very important to this oxidative burst. It was shown about 80 years back by Baldridge and Gerard, who named it the extra respiration of phagocytes. So the NADPH oxidase actually converts oxygen to superoxide, and superoxide, with the help of superoxide dismutase, becomes the hydrogen peroxide, and hydrogen peroxide is itself very reactive, but it generates the more reactive radicals like the hydroxyl radicals, the peroxyl radicals, and in combination with nitric oxide, it can form the peroxynitride. So this oxidative burst is very important, and the NADPH oxidase is a multi-subunit enzyme, and any defect in the enzyme causes chronic granulomatous disease, and patient neutrophils lack the ability to generate the respiratory burst and hence unable to kill pathogens. Where there are there are nodules all over in different parts of the body, in the organs as well. Why I mentioned this is to show that how oxidative burst is extremely essential for us, and why NADPH oxidase is so essential for our survival. Now, many years ago, we have shown using a parasite invading the macrophages. These are macrophages with invading parasites. And this is a lysosome, as the red stain shows you. And this is reactive oxygen species, as the green stain shows you. And if you overlap them, you'll see exactly the sites where the pathogens are. Reactive oxygen species is being generated. So in our 200,000 years of history, human history, the hosts have tried to kill the pathogen, and selective pressure is on the host to kill the pathogen, while the pathogen wants to establish an infection. So selective forces are on the pathogen to create an infection. So this has evolved our immune system, as I mentioned, and I couldn't help to get to have this this information about the coronavirus, which to me is very interesting. Is that in January, when it was sequenced, there was a D residue at the 614 at 614 amino acid. There was a D residue of the viral spike protein. By April, a single mutation in the genome was found, converting the D to a glycine. So presently, the D variant has been almost replaced by the G variant. Now, why the G variant came? So it provides some sort of selective advantage to the virus because the G transmits more rapidly than the D, and the number of functional spikes on each viral particle is 5 times higher because of this mutation. The patients infected with the G variant also has higher viral loads in their upper airways than did patients with the D residue. Now, this has been shown by infecting hamsters that is the same case that happens, which has higher viral loads and which means increased transmission. So here is an example of how the pathogens can change. And there is the story of the Australian rabbits, where Australia, in order to control the overpopulation of rabbits, the myxoma virus was introduced in some localities. Now, the first instance, 99.8% rabbits actually vanished. But then whatever was there grew. And in the second introduction of the myxoma virus, 90% died. Then when the third introduction was made, only 40 to 60% died. Actually, what happened, the virulence of the virus was decreasing, resistance was increasing, but the virus actually acquired the more ability to transmit rather than being very virulent, because obviously the pathogen will not like its host to die before it does its job. So these are very interesting examples that I wanted to share. Now, coming to the vector transmitted diseases, this is a very deadly combination of insects and pathogens. These are the vectors that can transmit diseases. You can see the tsetse fly, the flea, the mosquito, and the sandfly. I'm going to speak about a parasite that is carried by the sandfly. And more than 17% of all infectious diseases are caused by the vector-borne pathogens: malaria, dengue, chikungunya, Zika fever, yellow fever. There are many of them, and visceral and cutaneous leishmaniasis are the ones that is transmitted by the sandfly. And I'm going to speak something about the pathogen that causes visceral leishmaniasis. And these are all transmitted by insects, where the insects are intermediate hosts, where they host the pathogens for some time before being transmitted to the humans. This visceral leishmaniasis arrived at India in about the late 1800s, early 1800s, and then it was actually recognized during the late 1800s when villages in the district of Burdwan, villages after villages actually vanished because of this fever, this strange fever, and where the emaciated figure with a large spleen was actually the way the patients were seen. Now, there were many publications by the British Army people who called it the Burdwan fever or the Kala Azar. Now, there was a controversy about how this pathogen would be named, because the two British Army generals, Army doctors, William Nishman and Charles Donovan, they observed the parasite in pathology samples. This is an experimentally infected rat, and this is from a person who died in Dum in Calcutta, and the sample was taken to England, and where they analyzed it. So there was a controversy between Leishman and Donovan that what to call it. It may not be novel. It may be the malaria parasite. It may be some other parasite. So the British establishment actually called on to Sir Ronald Ross to settle the matter. And what he did was he looked at the slides closely, and then he also published a paper in the BMJ in 1903 that this is a novel pathogen, and this should be called Leishmania donovani, because of the names of Leishman and Donovan coming in. So this parasite was called Leishmania donovani, and the fever was called then the Dum fever. It came from Burdwan fever to the Dum fever. So this parasite is very interesting in the sense that it is one of the first mitochondrial eukaryotes, has a single mitochondrion, and it's not like the groups of mitochondria that the higher vertebrates have. And they stay in the very compartments that are supposed to kill them. They stay within the phagolysosomes. And these are there are two life forms. Actually, one life form is the free-swimming form, and the other is a round form, which is actually the disease-causing form staying within the human body. And they look under the microscope, they look like this, and they sort of move backwards in view. So as I said, that they stay within the phagolysosomes, which are where they're being bombarded by reactive oxygen species, and they are very robust, and they survive quite nicely within them if the infection is successful. Now, there is only one other organism which can survive within the phagolysosome, that is called Coxiella burnetii, which causes Q fever in animals and humans. And both these organisms can survive the NADPH the NADPH oxidase onslaught by superoxide and hydrogen peroxide, and they can survive in those compartments very fine. For that, they need very robust systems to defend themselves. So their first job is to prevent the oxidative stress-induced killing. And so what they have many defense mechanisms, but of the most important is one of them is the ergosterol. Our studies showed that the ergosterol, which makes up the membrane of the Leishmania donovani, actually acts as a natural antioxidant. And when we made knockouts by knocking out cytochrome P450s, what we saw that these parasites became susceptible to drugs. And these parasites, named as K39GE1 and LDGE1, are strains that are resistant parasites. Now, if you add ergosterol synthesis inhibitors to these parasites, they become susceptible to drugs. So that is how important ergosterol is, and it is a very primitive form of protection for these parasites. So other than that, there are two enzymes, the mitochondrial and cytosolic tripyridoxine peroxidases, which are actually the enzymes in the that are using the trypanothione in this cycle, and they are the terminal enzymes clearing the reactive oxygen species and its products. It exists as a decamer, and this is modeled after the trypanosoma cytosolic peroxidases. And what is interesting is that this mitochondrial tripyridoxine peroxidase is actually released into the media, into the culture media or its surroundings, as it would happen in vivo, that it is released into the surrounding media, and it binds to another protein inside the macrophages when the parasites get in, which is called the apoptosis inducing factor. And that protein, it actually transfers from mitochondria to the nucleus and causes DNA degradation. And so this AIF binding to the AIF and then creating this is why when the cell dies with the pathogen. So in order to prevent that, the parasite actually inhibits the apoptosis inducing factor through the tripyridoxine peroxidase enzyme, and the cells wouldn't die. So this is an adaptation the parasites have made, and many other pathogens also have made similar kind of adaptations, and there are just too many to describe, but I'm just taking the example of what we did and we showed. So, so as I said, that they are inside the phagolysosomes, and they would die by a very orderly process, the process of apoptosis, because if they die in not by a regulated process, then the host will be harmed. So this is a serial section through a confocal microscope where you can see the parasites sitting within, and this is the macrophage nucleus. And these green dots are the apoptotic markers, so they are actually dying by apoptosis within the macrophages without disturbing the host cell, actually. And this is a calcium-dependent process. And here what you see is that calcium is coming into the phagolysosomes once the drug is given. Now, the second interesting story is about a sort of a collaboration between the neutrophil and the macrophage, which the parasite uses very cleverly. And this is mainly through manipulating their host housekeeping processes like autophagy. So you see, what happens is that when the neutrophil is picking up the pathogens, it gets infected, and as soon as it gets infected, its life is very short. So it actually shows on its surface the signals that are called eat me signals, and that tells the that it has to pick up the cycle now because it is showing the eat me signals. It is ready to die. So the infected neutrophils are actually picked up by the macrophages, and what happens? The neutrophil dies there, but the parasites which were within the macrophages which were within the neutrophils are actually transferred to the macrophages by fooling the immune system, so an immune reaction is not initiated. So this is called the Trojan horse mechanism, found in some other pathogens as well. But here, as you can see, that the Leishmania parasite would be transferred to the macrophages through the neutrophils very efficiently. So if you look at the microscope, you will see that the macrophages are carrying these infected neutrophils. And what we showed is that the housekeeping process of autophagy, which occurs as soon as infection is there, as soon as infection is there, it is essential for that autophagy to be there for the macrophage to pick up the neutrophils. However, if you prevent the autophagic event by using 3-methyladenine, what happens that this step is actually blocked. So the macrophages are unable to take up the neutrophils, and there is no infection. So in this very bar graph, you can see that the infected Leishmania donovani, how many cells have been picked up, and as soon as you inhibit autophagy, that goes down significantly. So it shows that these kind of cellular processes are actually being utilized by these pathogens, and this is a very simple cellular process where membrane-bound structures are formed by carrying the cellular debris. It fuses with the lysosome and they are recycled. Whatever is required is recycled and rest of them is excreted out. So the pathogens have learned to use these systems as well. So our model actually showed that both canonical and non-canonical autophagy were initiated through Becklin-1 Rubicon pathway or the ALK complex. And that is how it was regulated, that how many neutrophils the macrophage will take up depending on the state of autophagy within them. Now, it is not that the autophagy is only required for the host cell. The parasite itself requires autophagy to survive, and our studies with the knockouts that we prepared where autophagy was inhibited, it interferes with the differentiation to infective forms and reduces the capability to infect. So this is how the process of autophagy becomes very important for both the pathogen as well as its host. Now, the Leishmania donovani has been treated for very, very long time by heavy metal, which is antimony. It's a special preparation of antimony that was prepared by Professor U.N. Brahmachari. And as you can see that this was during the time of the epidemic that happened in Assam. Over a period of 10 years, he saved thousands and thousands of people by using this antimony. It is a pentavalent antimony that is taken up by the macrophages, and within the macrophages are lying the pathogens, and it is converted to trivalent antimony, and then the pathogens are killed. And our studies have shown that there is an increase in reactive oxygen species once the trivalent antibody is formed, and it is done with two heavy metals. One is arsenic and one is the antimony. And so this is the mechanism by which the antimony actually kills, and it is still being used, this antimony. There are no real side effect free drugs for the Leishmania. So there is a third option, that is the pathogens could manipulate the host machinery. we know that there are a family of proteins called the BCL2 family and the BAX family and the BH3 only family of proteins, of which the BCL2 family is the ones which are pro-survival proteins, and the BAX and the BH3 only family are anti-survival proteins. So what happens, we have shown that when the pathogen comes to the macrophages, it binds to the TLR2 receptor on the surface of the macrophages. And then that stimulates the phosphorylates the PI3 kinase, which phosphorylates the AKT. And what they do, they actually destroy one of the pro-apoptotic proteins, which is bad, there, and thereby preventing the cell from actually undergoing death. In addition, it through the phospho-ARC and phosphorylation of the STAT3, they increase the quantity of BCL2 being expressed, and BCL2 inhibits INOS, and INOS generates nitric oxide, so nitric oxide cannot be generated and the pathogen will survive. When we looked at patients of leishmaniasis, what we found is that the level of BCL2 in these patients are raised, but when in pre-treatment, the INOS is low, but when the treatment is given, the INOS is actually increased, suppressing the production of nitric oxide. So this whole capability of a pathogen to manipulate the host proteins is a very important one, and I have earlier mentioned that it also manipulates the AIF, and this is found. I'm showing it with the parasite, but viruses are even smarter because they have a different mode of transmission, and so they actually code for some of these proteins, and when they are invading a cell, they would substitute the cellular proteins by their own proteins and manipulate the whole system. So for the leishmaniasis, as I said, there are pentavalent antimonians are still being used. They have severe side effects. So does miltefosine and paramomycin. The only drug which is now being used extensively is the liposomal amphotericin B. So there are no vaccines also. So I wanted to touch upon one thing, that why our immune system is so we are so variable in our responses to the pathogens. Now, before that, I just wanted to say that what our studies actually showed, that we have interference points where pro-oxidants can be used to have oxidative stress-induced killing, or anti-cytosolic tripyridoxine peroxidase to prevent the protection to the pathogens, or using anti-autophagic agents, which are under clinical trials for cancer, which can be repurposed. Then also the BCL2 inhibitors, which are now being used for cancer patients, can also be repurposed for the treatment of leishmaniasis, and leading to pathogen death. So these are the few points that we actually think that are important points of interference. Now, why immune responses are so variable? This is a very important question, and this is the most important question, because as we are seeing here, that some people cannot survive the corona disease and some people can. So when the dendritic cells that I showed you, when they present the antigens to the T cells, it's a very complicated process, because the dendritic cells actually chew up the pathogens and provide the small peptides or antigens from those to the cytotoxic T cell or the helper T cells, along with the MHC class 2 or MHC class 1 antigens. Now, this is a fit that happens here, that in the MHC class 1 or class 2, the peptide should fit in order to be presented to the T cells. And T cells are actually activated by these complexes. Now, depending on how the shape of this groove is, how the fit is, your immune response will be dictated. So there is a strong selective pressure on pathogens, mutate genes that encode antigens so that they can evade this mechanism, the T cell presentation, because as soon as T cell presentation is there, the T cells will tell the B cells to produce antibodies, and the cytotoxic T cells will come and kill the pathogens. So it is a pressure on the pathogens to sort of avoid this kind of event, by altering its shape so that it wouldn't fit into these grooves. But fortunately, we have a huge number of the HLA antigens, which are the products of MHC complexes, which is major histocompatibility locus, and it produces a lot of these proteins, and there is an immense variability in that, and that is why how the human race has been saved all along during the evolution. So what the MHC does is actually you have to have more than one type of MHC molecule in an individual. We have many. And differences in the MHC molecules between individuals is actually responsible why we do not respond similarly to all pathogens. The way I respond to a pathogen, way you respond to a pathogen is they're different. These HLA loci can actually be mapped. So the HLA class, this HLA-DRB1, HLA-DQA1 is a region which contributes to susceptibility to visceral leishmaniasis, whether the patients are coming from Brazil or from India. So this is a very important loci. So similarly, for genetic factors in SARS outbreak pathogenesis in 2003, in a group of Taiwanese patients, it was seen that this is the genotype they have, and the haplotype was associated with the severity of the SARS infection. In Hong Kong Chinese patients, a strong association was between HLA B0703 or HLA DRB1 0301 alleles and increased susceptibility to SARS infection. So this is very important. This is a thing that takes time to do. But if you can do a HLA mapping of people who are more susceptible to coronavirus infection, they can be put in the bag, and the ones that will tolerate well these infections can be put in the front line of defense in terms of doctors and medical practitioners and the other healthcare workers. So this is a very, very important issue that one has to tackle. Now, I just wanted to mention about leishmaniasis. One positive thing about leishmania is that it's almost wiped out now. Although you cannot rely, it can emerge at any time. But it was due to the very rigid vector control, rapid diagnosis, and whatever treatment, although it had many side effects, the treatments were given, there were follow-ups, and extremely dedicated health workers in the villages. They have actually succeeded in reducing the incidence of leishmaniasis, although we have not wiped it out totally. Visceral leishmaniasis sort of being tackled. The cutaneous leishmaniasis remains a problem all over the world. But visceral leishmaniasis, primarily India, has been almost wiped out. So with now there is no vaccine for leishmaniasis. The drugs have so much side effects. So these kind of efforts have actually shown that these vector-mediated diseases can be controlled efficiently. So then one of the things that I wanted to point out here is that it is basic research which has sort of saved us in a way from the coronavirus, because we had a lot of basic information. So research and development funding primarily sponsored research towards diseases that was capturing the imagination of the public. But for example, Ebola research funding was about 178 million. But at the height of the West African outbreak that happened, that it increased and to 594 million. But it will now decrease because Ebola will fade from public consciousness as the disease is no longer occurring in West Africa. Now, Zika research had $6 million in 2015, but after it surfaced in Brazil, the amount was boosted to 243 million in 2017. Coronavirus funding in Middle East respiratory syndrome, MERS, which was more virulent than the current one, and the SARS, which is again more virulent than the current one, were just 4.6% of total basic research funding for emerging infectious diseases. The total annual funding for coronavirus stood at $41 million in 2018, but now it is enormously funded, this current coronavirus that we're having. So we'll never be actually prepared for the next pandemic, if we only invest in R&D targeting, grabbing headlines at the time, says the Policy Cures Research Bureau, which is actually something that we should ponder about. As I said about the leishmaniasis, that it is sort of eliminated, we see. Today we are saying it is sort of eliminated, but we don't know, it may surface at any time again. And with the with AIDS coming in where people are immune compromised, any infection like the leishmaniasis, the tuberculosis, can really play havoc with them. And then to top it all, now we have these viruses, emerging diseases that are coming out. So I think we need to infuse a lot of money into basic research as well as in applied research where diagnostics and drugs can be developed. This is said over and over again, and I'm saying it over again. And so these are my soldiers who worked for some of the studies that I showed you. And these are the funding agencies. So thank you very much for your attention. Professor Singhvi.
Thank you very much, Professor Chandramasa, for a very comprehensive overview and a success story on leishmania. May I request you now to welcome Professor Mehta. And I request Professor Mehta to share his screen, and Professor Chandramasa may introduce him for his talk for INSA medal for service to science and society.
Yes, I extend a very warm welcome to Professor Mehta, who was past president of INSA at ICSU. And he's currently University Distinguished Professor and Dr. Kalam Anji Reddy Chair for School of Chemistry at University of Hyderabad. He was elected to the Academy in 1983. Professor Mehta, a very warm welcome to you. Please.
Well, thank you very much. Let me first get the to share the screen. I'm struggling. I'm not getting it. So I hope that is.
Yeah. We can ask the INSA office to help you in this. I can call them.
So you need to click on share screen, sir.
I did.
No, it will open a window, and again there is a share in the center. You click that part of it.
Yeah. No. Okay.
Yeah.
Yes, it's coming now.
Can you see?
So the top screen you have to press.
Yes.
It's coming now.
We can see that now.
Can you see my screen?
Yes,
Yeah.
sir.
Yes.
And can you see the cursor moving as well?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. So, Madam President, Professor Singhvi, distinguished fellows of the Academy, and esteemed guests, I just wish to say that when I received the award letter for promotion and service to science medal way back in 2017 from then president, my instinct was to ask for what? Because I have been fortunate to be able to pursue my passion in life for 5 decades and felt that this itself was the biggest blessing. And so what else is needed? Be as it may, thank you, Academy, for this gracious gesture. In my lecture today, as you will see from the title, which you can see on the screen, I'm going to touch many issues, some familiar, some mundane, but all of them of contemporary concern. And of course, my coverage will have a lot of breadth, but very little depth. It is basically to sensitize the scientific community about issues which are important to science and scientists, and also by inference to the academies. So if I have to say what the theme of my lecture is, you see that this is an opportunity for all of us to take a selfie with the scientific landscape and something more. And I hope that after the lecture and some of the issues that I raise, everybody will relook at the selfie. I tried to give some structure to my presentation. There are 5 verticals that I am going to touch upon. First, science, its method and scientific thought, how scientific thought evolved, values in science, and try to identify some markers. Then I will spend some time on the emergent role of science in this century, which has to be focused on sustainability. So I will also try to explain what I mean by sustainability and so on, because this is a very widely used term, but very few understand its full implications. I will then talk about scientists, objectivity and professionalism. I think objectivity and professionalism matters most, both for science and scientists, but by and large, we are deficient. So I'm going to try and hold a mirror for all of us, including for myself, when I talk about objectivity and professionalism. And finally, a few minutes on reimagining science academies. Professor Singhvi has already said what INSA should be doing. I'm not going to talk about what INSA should be doing. I'm going to talk about what role academies possibly can have in a few minutes' time. So let me first say, what is science? Each one of us harbors very different understanding of science. Actually, science defies a precise definition. Although a little later I will give you some definition which people have labored very hard to craft, but actually science cannot be defined in my view. But science is certainly identifiable by a set of key characteristics, and we'll talk about these characteristics. Where did science come from and why did science come? Actually, science is a product of the intrinsic human spirit of awe and wonder at nature and the physical world. And this led to systematic study, structure, behavior of nature and the physical world, and then it led to construction of knowledge. In fact, quest for knowledge is intrinsic to many civilizations and many cultures, including our own. India itself also has a very rich tradition of seeking knowledge. And so the advance of knowledge has been there for several millennia, but a milestone was reached about 2,500 years ago when Plato made a proposition that all knowledge can be reasoned. And this formulation by Plato actually set the stage for the evolution eventually of the science as we know today. One of his disciples, Aristotle, further advanced this idea, and he said knowledge can be traced to observation and measurement. And so the construction of knowledge actually evolved into the area of investigation, which is called epistemology, which is basically construction of knowledge. And over the years, it became progressive, it also became normative, and for many, many centuries, science was loosely practiced as evidence, observation, and experimentation. But the modern science, as we understand today, was actually born in 17th century, or rather recognized in the 17th century by British scientist, philosophers, thinker, Francis Bacon, and also concurrently in France by René Descartes, again a philosopher and a thinker. And in fact, it is believed that the term science was coined by Francis Bacon. There is no evidence, but there is some anecdotal evidence to that regard. Modern science, as you know, is evidence-based, rational, and reproducible. And concurrently with the advance towards science, there is also a methodological advance towards science. And you see here that method of science, all very familiar to you, so I'm not going to dwell upon it. Always begins by asking a question and eventually ends up in subjecting it to peer review and normative standards. So this continued post 17th century for about 2 centuries. But in 20th century, another signpost was put in place, and we should all be very proud that India had a major role in this. The idea of scientific temper originated in India through the efforts of our former Prime Minister, Mr. Nehru. and has been enshrined now in our constitution as a fundamental duty of every Indian. And this is therefore a good moment for many of us who might have forgotten what scientific temper is to spend few seconds to capture what scientific temper is. The scientific temper is a way of life. It is an attitude based on the application of logic. And more importantly, elements of fairness, equality, and democracy are built into it. So it's a very important facet of our inheritance of in terms of our constitution and the constitutional values. And it served us well in 19th century. But in the 20th century, but in the 21st century, now social scientists and philosophers propose alternate forms of rationality with cultural and historical moorings, which need to be debated and explored. So what we need is a new synthesis and a new inclusive version of science as we have learned all these centuries. I will share with you two thoughts by two very eminent scholars. One which says there is hardly any social problem on which science cannot make some contribution. And the another view is science is never sufficient to solve a problem completely. It is, however, always necessary. On the face of it, they appear to be contradictory. But if you look deeply into this, they are in fact complementary, because what they try to do is they try to argue that all knowledge has interfaces, and science, as one of the major streams of knowledge, also has an interface. So one thing that is emerging in the 21st century is, and I think we as scientists should give a lot of thought to this emerging concept, is it is time to revisit and amplify the expanse of science. And I have few ideas to share with you in this regard. These are not my original ideas, but this is summary I have drawn from what I have been reading in recent years. Science has to become not only seamless, but more inclusive. And its motto has to be advance human well-being. Science should also endeavor and recognize that there are overlapping spaces of possibilities, which can only be explored along with all knowledge streams. Science alone cannot handle them. Very important, this has been talked about, but we have not made much headway, is the idea of realigning science, society, and policy. It has always been an uneasy relationship, but this is an essential relationship. And we should continue, therefore, to have realignment, updating of science, society, and policy interface. It's also very important to have an informed dialogue between scholars, civil society, and policymakers. And this is not an on and off switch. This has to be a continuum. And what important lesson that COVID has taught us is that we have to invent a citizen-scientist collaboration. And this collaboration will eventually lead to trust in science, which is fundamentally important. We can notice some signs that in the COVID times and now eventually in post-COVID times, the trust level has gone up. We have to sustain it. We have to make it more deeper into the roots of our society. And I do believe that this is one area, the citizen-scientist collaboration, where academies have a possible role in future. So let me share with you the science definition, which is very often quoted. This is the product of 1 year of hard work by the Science Council of UK, and it was disclosed in March of 2009. Science is the pursuit of knowledge and understanding of the natural and social world following a systematic methodology based on evidence. So you can see here is an attempt to connect the natural and the social world and also to expand the definition of science. But in my view, this is still very inadequate. We have to have a much more inclusive view of science. Let me shift to science and values and the evolving ethical dimension. You know, for centuries, particularly in the 18th and 19th century, what we call as era of positivism, fact and value dichotomy existed. Historically, science was considered to be dealing exclusively with facts and knowledge, and it was considered free of values. It sounds strange today, but it's a fact that science had a free run in the 18th and 19th century. But in the 20th century, when challenges arose to catastrophic world wars took place, science was recognized as a social responsibility. And therefore, the idea of responsible science evolved, because science can also produce unintended consequences. So last 50, 60 years have been actually the era of post-positivism, where responsible science and accountable science has come to the fore. However, in the 21st century, as we stare at global challenges in an interconnected world, we need to develop new ethical values for science, and new normative model and general ethical norms need to be evolved. So we have a new phrasing, maybe neo-positivism, but neo-positivism has always been used, but we have to now have a new phrase to define the values and of science with an ethical component. To us Indians, it should not surprise us. It's not something new. Gandhiji, 100 years ago, identified 7 deadly sins. And one of the sins that he identified was science without humanity. In fact, for his time, this expression of Gandhi was all-inclusive. Even today, it is all-inclusive. What is science without humanity? And of course, when we talk of humanity, social sciences, other knowledge streams are embedded in it. So we should go back and try to position science as something which includes everything. Well, science has been for human good. So science is a passion for truth. Science is a perpetual quest. Science is universal. Science is utilitarian. Science connects the world. Science helps secure the environment. Science helps lighting the world. Science helps in issues related to health and well-being. It addressing the issue of global warming, mitigating man-made and natural disasters. Science has addressed the issue of hunger, food, and nutritional security. And science also is very supportive of human rights, because science is supporting and science works for freedom from want and fear, the cardinal principles of human rights. Science of science, which is now a very emergent area of activity, is for predictive future, and you can very well see this is very, very important. Science also has played a major role, continues to play a major role in eliminating poverty and inequalities. But the future of science lies in sustainability. Sustainability has to be at the vanguard of future endeavors of science. And I'm sure that science will not let down this intrinsic thing which is needed for human good, because human good is good, but we also must worry about planetary good. And planetary good is being threatened today. It was in 1980s that the Brundtland Commission, established by the United Nations, actually put forward the idea of sustainable development. And it's very nicely defined in the UN Charter as meeting the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. I prefer another definition of sustainable development. This is based on an old American Indian saying, "We do not inherit the earth from our ancestors, we borrow it from our children." So it will be wrong for us as humans at a given point of time to consider any proprietary rights on the planet, on our earth. And therefore, I prefer this particular definition. Very quickly, in 1 minute, why sustainability? Sustainability because planet is approaching environmental tipping points. There have been 9 tipping points which have been identified uh, for sustainability, and we should not cross these tipping points. But as you can see from this depiction, that there are at least 3 areas where we are on the threshold of these tipping points. And therefore, a lot of remedial steps have to be taken and sustainability has to be ensured. The reason is that Earth system is not only complexity ridden, its interconnectedness is unbelievable, which makes it both resilient as well as vulnerable. And small perturbation of these Earth systems can have catastrophic events and effects. We are already seeing some of it in certain areas. So it is very important that we must prevent our planet from reaching the tipping points. This is something which is very well known. The idea that Earth will become eventually unsustainable is almost 50 years old. A group of thinkers and thought leaders met in Rome in the 1970s, and they called themselves Club of Rome. And they came out with a beautiful report called The Limits to Growth. And if you see at the bottom, I have indicated in the same page because they're not very visible. They actually focused on predicament of mankind. The Club of Rome revisited the limits to growth after 30 years, and then again revisited in 2012 and projected or forecast the next 40 years for our planet up to 2052. So we have had the benefit of many far-sighted people who carried out in-depth foresight analysis of our world. But the follow-up steps were rather weak. So we know what the limits of the world system are. I have indicated them. And we have now, as a result of this, much better understanding of planetary boundaries. But the sad fact is that we lost 30 to 40 years. 3 or 4 decades were lost, despite early warnings which have been on the horizon since 1970, which is again a surprise because the father of our nation had mentioned a century ago, the world has enough for everyone's need, but not enough for everyone's greed. Nonetheless, there is a silver lining. Finally, in 2015, United Nations identified Sustainable Development Goals. SDGs has become now much talked about theme and acronym. And our country happily is very strongly committed to SDGs. Many advances have been made. But what is important that all these 17 SDG goals have some component of science and also of policy. And therefore, a stronger, firm, non-negotiable commitment of science and scientists to sustainable development goals will go a long way in ensuring the sustainability of our planet. This great girl, Greta Thunberg, the climate crusader, while addressing the US Congress said, "Wake up, listen to the scientists." I can only repeat, every country, everywhere political leadership and policymakers should listen to the scientists. And to touch a little bit on the geopolitical arena, peripherally, of course, we must recognize that everyone has aspirations and everyone is vulnerable. There is a lot of talk going around in last few years that globalization is on the retreat, globalization idea is receding. Well, it may be so. However, as far as sustainability is concerned, national interests and global aspirations need to coalesce. And that is the only way forward, coming together for a common cause of ensuring sustainability. Okay, let me switch gears and say something about scientists. What is a scientist? Who is a scientist? Of course, there are many textbook definitions. If you Google, you will find many, many expressions. I have also put one of them here, but I will not read it, but you will be able to identify the most familiar traits which are associated with a scientist. I have tried to identify these traits. What makes a scientist? I'm not talking of good or bad. I'm simply saying what makes a scientist. And let me capture for you some of these traits. A scientist is an individual who is curious, creative, and intuitive, and obsessed with asking always how and why. Scientist also is someone who is patient and persistent, because reproducibility, validation, and credibility to peers and to the society is a fundamental aspect. And therefore, when you produce something, you have to produce which is credible and which is very well validated. Scientist has to be courageous and risk taker. And scientists must believe that failures are instructive. Many years ago, I had the opportunity to read the biography of Dr. Meghnad Saha. And one sentence in there I still remember. Meghnad Saha had said, if I had any success in my life, it was built on the foundation of failures. So failure is also an intrinsic trait of a scientist. Scientists are detail-oriented. They are observant. They must be hawk-eyed, and they must be what I like to call perspicacious. That is the ability to identify deeply and productively what they see and what they experience. Scientists have to be open-minded and communicative. There is no room for dogma and for deceit in practice of science. I will have something more to say about it. And of course, scientist has to be an upholder of values and ethos of science. In fact, in this context, I will surf many horizons shortly. But let me before that share you my favorite definition of a scientist given by a fairly eminent chemist, Hildebrandt. But being a chemist, as one always expect, he was not taken very seriously. But I want to read what he said a scientist should be or scientist should be. Scientists proceed by common sense and ingenuity. There are no rules, only the principles of integrity and objectivity. And he said, scientists only recognize the authority of fact. And I think this is a very nice way of looking at a scientist. Now I will touch upon values with which scientists are associated and should uphold the values. Values of objectivity, fairness, persona, and professionalism. Now, actually, this is scientist Achilles' heel. We profess all these virtues of objectivity, fairness, persona, and professionalism, but it's obvious we don't conform to them, we don't practice them as we should. To address these issues, there is no one-size-fits approach. There's a beautiful French expression to capture this. I will not try to read it because I will only mispronounce it, even if I try my best. But what this French expression really means, everybody is different. Everybody has his or her own way. And that's so true. And therefore, there is no one-size-fits approach even in defining and working out the values of science. I do believe that in publicizing, in making values of science, particularly sense of objectivity and fairness, and how to integrate persona with professionalism should be one of the major activities that academies should focus on. I was very impressed. Professor Singhvi had identified many areas for our academy, but I think this should be done by every academy, including ours all over. So what is this objectivity and fairness? I want to capture this iconic message that you always hear on the London tube whenever you get out. Mind the gap between the train and the platform. And I want to say, mind the gap between objectivity and fairness with regard to where you compromise these two fundamental elements of being a scientist and practice of science. I have here why I am emphasizing this. You know, the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy this year says, and I have this quote from there, the admiration of science in public and the authority science enjoys stems to a large extent from the view that science is objective, or at least more so than modes of inquiry. This also applies to scientists. And therefore, when we try to work out the idea and ideal of objectivity, it should be such that it is strong enough to be valuable, weak enough to be attainable, and workable in practice. Because it's nice to preach about objectivity and fairness, but to implement it in practice is very challenging. So I think this is a good way of approaching this. I've tried to indicate some pathway to objectivity. First is faithfulness to facts. Reject hearsay and views from nowhere. Avoid contextual value judgment and preferred bias, particularly the second one. Reject hearsay. All of us sit on committees. All of us make assessments, judgments, and we think, oh, we make this because we have heard somewhere somebody saying like this. This has no place in objectivity. Only stick to facts, and facts only should guide sense of objectivity. We should have zero tolerance for questionable research practices, and of course, we should judiciously take recourse or use scientometric data. It's a very nice saying again in that report from Stanford. He says, differentiate between qualities that vary with one's perspective and qualities that remain constant even with changes in perspective. So this is fundamentally important. Objectivity and fairness leads to credibility, and credibility leads to trust. And this is what is going to raise the value and the esteem of science in society if we stick to these three. And this applies to individual, it also applies to institutions. Reputation. Reputations are not built overnight. Reliability is not built overnight. Everybody craves for recognition. Regrettably, these days, more than in earlier days, everybody wants recognition. And of course, everybody also wants peer esteem. But nobody recognizes the fact that it is the sense of objectivity and fairness and sticking to the values of science which will get you recognition as well as peer esteem. I want to now talk about a few things which are very important for both objectivity and fairness. The first is commitment to diversity. There is no half-hearted or partial commitment to diversity. Diversity is a holistic concept, and everybody should take a holistic view of diversity. We wrote an article a couple of years ago, I think 2018, with the perspective of chemical sciences in equality, diversity, and inclusion. But we gave this title chemical sciences because it was published in a chemistry journal. But this is applicable to all sciences. And when I talk of holistic view of diversity, it's beyond gender, beyond caste, beyond religion. It's a very, very wholesome, holistic concept. And I think the discovery or the approval of the first mRNA-based COVID vaccine last week in UK, and now FDA has also given this week to this vaccine. You see, diversity is at play. It's an outstanding example of diversity. The core team which developed this vaccine, there were 2 Turks, 2 women, and 1 Greek, 1 Hungarian also. So 4, you can see the diversity. The important thing is that you see here representatives from countries which are quite antagonistic, but for human good, pursuit of science, they work together. So diversity is to be celebrated all the time, everywhere, every part of the world. And I think this example is the best illustration that I can offer you of how diversity is important in science. We also made a case that when we talk of diversity, ethics, research practices, integrity, it is more an issue of culture than of compliance. And we wrote a guest editorial again last year where we make a case that cultural competency is fundamental in science. But we should have, of course, proper understanding of what cultural competency is. And this is what we have tried to elaborate. I'm not making publicity of what we have contributed, but I'm just telling you somewhere where you can have a feel of it rather easily. The sense of objectivity and fairness also require that we should launch a crusade against what we call as HH and FF. And this is increasingly important where we have increasing tendency for hype. Fake philia is very prevalent, and so is dichotomania. And therefore, arresting HHFF is extremely important. And once again, this is not a publicity gimmick, but we wrote an essay on ethical research, and we make a case, it just appeared a few months ago, blocking the hype, hypocrisy, falsification, fakery pathway. That is what HHFF is. And I think this is very, very important. I will not elaborate on that. I do grant that scientists are entitled to their eureka moments, like Archimedes, like Newton, when they said eureka, uttered strongly. In fact, there is this anecdote that Archimedes ran without his clothes at that eureka moment. But we lesser mortals should be mindful of the threshold of exuberance. I think scientists are entitled to exuberance, feel that sense of joy of discovery, but should know where the line between exuberance and hype lies, because it can be a very slippery slope. And I believe that academies also have a role in trying to help arrest HHFF pathway, or at least slow it down. Now I will, in the last section on this, I will shift to persona and professionalism and try to highlight why persona and professionalism matters. And I will use some examples from my own discipline of chemistry, not because they are more important, but because I am more familiar with them, and I hope I can authentically speak about them. I'll tell you about Langmuir. He got Nobel Prize for surface chemistry. To every practitioner of nanoscience and technology, Langmuir is a familiar name because you cannot see the nano architecture without generating, in most cases, the Langmuir blotted films. But look at his persona. He hobnobbed with the likes, his contemporary likes like Einstein and Bohr. He was highly influential, very interactive, very communicative. He appeared on the cover of magazines. For his times, he appeared on the cover page of Time, which was considered the big prestige, at that given point of time. He interacted with industry, General Electric, GE, and he guided many innovations in General Electric. So you can see a very wholesome, very interactive, very participative persona. And he, in his time, was recognized as a great leader of science, not only of chemistry, but of science. I give you another example of a very famous chemist, G.N. Lewis. And every learner of chemistry or even science would have heard about G.N. Lewis, because you always talk of Lewis acids and Lewis bases and so on. And Lewis built the University of California, Berkeley department, among the best in the world. And it continues to be so even today. But as a person, he was brilliant, but recluse. Many believe, including myself, he should have got 2 Nobel Prizes, but he got none and allegedly committed suicide in 1946 in his laboratory. The message that I want to convey for all scientists: align persona to professional demands. It's important to align persona to professional demands. And in pursuit of science and in being a scientist, there is no room for cognitive dissonance. So you have to have your behavioral and cognitive things in place. I want to give you another example. Rivalries, fights are very common among scientists. It's also common in chemists. But where is the threshold? How far you can carry this rivalry? How far and for what? And again, I'll give you 2 examples. These are authentic examples because I have given you a reference where they appear. Arrhenius, whose equation on kinetics of reactions is very well known, got Nobel Prize in 1903. And Nernst, more or less his contemporary, got his Nobel Prize in 1920 for study of electrochemistry. Actually, the electrochemistry owes its birth to Nernst, as much as to Faraday, of course. But look what they were doing after getting the Nobel Prize. His legacy secure. Arrhenius, as chair of the Nobel Institute for Physical Chemistry in Stockholm, spent his life blocking the prize nominations of rivals like Nernst. And Nernst, when his turn came, he blocked of Lewis and many others. I'm sure many of you, if you put your hand on the heart, will find very familiar. If I was giving this lecture in the auditorium of INSA, you will be looking around next door to find what others do to you and what rivalry can do to you. But this is a very important lesson. Always respect and accommodate the scientific contributions and creativity of peers and competitors. If you don't do this, I'm afraid I would be very hesitant to call you a scientist. Because there is a better way of dealing with this. And again, I give you example of 2 Nobel laureates, Derek Barton, who got Nobel Prize in 1969, and Bob Woodward in 1965. Both are actually iconic figures in 20th century science. I want to just read out to you what Barton wrote in a letter to Woodward when he was in Stockholm to receive the Nobel Prize. And I'll just read it. This seems a good moment to thank you for the remarkable inspiration you gave me in 1949 and 50 when they had an interaction. You transported me to that at that time from one world of chemistry to another which I had not imagined to exist. Both Barton and Woodward were bitter rivals, but do you know how they handled themselves? And this is a very important lesson for us to live. Lastly, persona and professionalism must be integrated with humility, because humility is very important in science. We all know about Marie Curie, who has left a great legacy of passion, which we all talk about, but very few talk about her humility. Einstein is reported to have remarked that Madame Curie was probably the only person who was not corrupted by fame that she had won. Just look at that virtue, not to be corrupted by fame. Most of us spend time chasing fame, but not to be get corrupted by fame is an extraordinary attribute to be celebrated, remembered, and applauded. Another Nobel Prize winner, Dan Shechtman, who got Nobel Prize in 2011 for his discovery of quasi-crystal, the great discovery of recent years, put it very simply: a good scientist is a humble scientist. And I hope all of us must strive to be good scientists. And if you are good scientists, we also ought to be humble scientists. But you don't have to look overseas. We have ourselves a shining example of father of chemistry and chemical industry in India, Acharya P.C. Ray. He could integrate ideas with idealism. Think a little. You can have ideas, you can have idealism, but they don't normally converge. It needs an extraordinary individual like Acharya P.C. Ray to converge ideas and idealism. And he has left a venerable legacy of humility and patriotism worth emulating. Last 2 minutes, I must say something about science academies. The traditional role of science academies, I'm not talking of our academy, I'm talking all over, including, of course, INSA. Promotion and recognition of excellence, scientific outreach, societal connect, science education, publications, and policy inputs, if and ever asked for policy inputs. Some, of course, academies are regularly asked for their inputs, and they do it quite well, admirably, and taken seriously. But here I will not say what academies should do. I would say I would ask some questions. And these questions also apply to our academy. First, we should ask and debate, are academies fit for purpose in the changing world? Most academies are quite old institutions and organizations. Are they structured to deliver? You cannot deliver on great ambition if your structures do not match that ambition. Are they too much internally focused and consumed? And I'm glad that Professor Singhvi in his presentation raised this issue. I didn't want to sound too impolite, but I think we waste too much time and get internally consumed. Election to fellowship is something that's one of the activities, that's not the most important activity of the academy. And I can tell you in private the stories that I hear about this particular activity, not in public, of course. Do they have societal esteem and clout with the policymakers? We want to give advice, but we cannot do unless we have. Sorry? Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Okay. I'll just finish in next 2 minutes. Are they internally focused and consumed? Do they have societal esteem and clout with the policymakers? Has their prestige and sheen faded? I'm not sharing a great secret with you. World over, because of the change in the geopolitical climate, the academies have lost their clout in all parts of the world, including the famed ones. Some have lost more, some have lost less, but the sheen associated with the academies have faded. And we should ask ourselves, how often do academies re-ideate and reinvent themselves? It's a good question to ask our own academies as well. Okay, so I make few suggestions about reimagined role, which I think will do a lot of credit to the academy and to the science and to the scientific community and serve the nation. Academies should be guardians of non-discrimination, equity in the pursuit of science. Academies should endeavor to safeguard moral and ethical values related to the conduct and responsibility of individual scientists. I mean, holding seminars and symposia are important for dissemination, but something much more needs to be done. Academies should be promoters of objectivity, transparency, and fairness befitting our profession. But you must, before indulge in this, you should say, will academies themselves pass these tests of objectivity and transparency and fairness? If not, then there will be no credibility, even if you want to imagine and assume that new role. Finally, aspire and position to be science advisors to the nation. You know, this is one of the mottos of the National Academy of Sciences in the United States, that with the Academy of Science, Engineering, and Medicine, they project themselves as science advisors to the nation. This is a role which we should try and make sure is also for our academy. So the point is, we must start now. debate the essential add-ons. Whatever we are doing is fine. But what should be the add-ons that academies should do, including our academy, in the emergent 21st century world, and reinvent ourselves? And we can ask this question for our academy. When did we reinvent last? I think you'll have to look at the archives. So thank you so much for your kind attention. I would like to take this opportunity to thank people who support my research. My research is 100% supported by industry and corporate sector, and therefore it is essential to acknowledge this is a good opportunity to acknowledge the research support that I receive. Okay, thank you once again. Thank you, Madam President, for giving me an opportunity.
Thanks, Professor Mehta, for a very fascinating talk. And I wish you had another 2 hours to talk, and we were willing to listen to you. So hope we will capture you once again to INSA. But now for a formality, I would request Professor Githiasan to read the citation of the medal.
Thank you, Professor Singhmi. So the INSA Medal for Promotion and Service to Science recognizes scientists who have rendered exceptional service for promoting science in India. It is awarded once in 3 years. It is my very great pleasure to announce that for the year 2017, the medal has been awarded to Professor Govardhan Mehta, who is also past president INSA. His scientific achievements include exploring diverse areas of organic synthesis. At the School of Chemistry in University of Hyderabad, his group achieved the total synthesis of over 20 natural products. A notable contribution was the synthesis of triquinanes using only heat and light, recognized as a seminal example of green synthesis. At Bengaluru, he initiated a major program for the design of carba-sugar-based glycomimics, conceptualized and realized a new family of polycyclitols, and achieved total synthesis of complex bioactive natural products. He has been the recipient of numerous awards from both national and international science academies and societies. I wish to thank Professor Mehta for a very thought-provoking lecture, and on behalf of the President and Fellows of INSA, I congratulate Professor Mehta on receiving this medal and wish him continued scientific achievements in his current position. Professor Singhmi, you are muted.
I request Professor Chandrima Sahawa to welcome Professor Vijay Raghavan. And I saw him smiling when Professor Mehta was concluding, because probably there is some kind of resonance of what Professor Mehta ended with and he will start with. So welcome, Vijay, for your lecture. But before that, I'll request Professor Chandrima Saha to introduce you formally.
A very warm welcome to Professor Vijay Raghavan to our annual meet. And it's indeed a pleasure to introduce him, although he does not really need an introduction, but I will do so for formality's sake. He is the Principal Scientific Advisor, Government of India, and he was Secretary of Department of Biotechnology and Director of the National Center for Biological Sciences. Professor Vijay Raghavan was elected to the fellowship in 1999. He is acclaimed for his work in developmental biology, genetics, and neurogenetics. Professor Vijay Raghavan is fellow of all the 3 academies and the World Academy of Sciences. He is foreign associate of the European Molecular Biology Organization, Royal Society UK, and the foreign associate of the US National Academy of Sciences. Professor Vijay Raghavan is a recipient of the Distinguished Alumnus Award of IIT Kanpur, Shanti Sharif Bhatnagar Award, J.C. Bose Fellowship, Jawaharlal Nehru Birth Centenary Lecture of INSA. He was conferred the Padma Shri in 2013 and also is a recipient of the Infosys Prize in the Life Sciences. This is his introduction. Professor Vijay Raghavan, I very warmly welcome to speak to us, and I'm sure we will enjoy your talk.
Thank you very, very much, Chandrima. It's a great pleasure and an honor to be here amongst colleagues and friends. And I did hear Professor Mehta speak and about what the Academy should be doing. Let me start by saying that although the title of my talk is about science academies and policy, I would like to start not by focusing on that aspect, but about where we stand today in the world and where we are going in terms of science and what we need to do. In that context, what should science academies do is the question, and in particular, what should our academy do is a more specific question. All you need to do is to go to the INSA website, and if you go to the website and you look at what is given in terms of objectives of INSA, it has the promotion of scientific knowledge, coordination among science academy societies, to act as a body for promotion of the interests of scientists in India, and to present internationally the work done in the country, to interact with national committees, with the government, to publish, to promote and maintain liaison between science and humanities, to secure and manage funds and endowments for the promotion of science, and to promote all other acts necessary for fulfillment of the above. My frustration, and all of us, are equally, no one's jumping around saying that, we have done this job well. So this is not to blame anyone today, but to actually put the responsibility on all of us. All we need to do is to look at what the world is today, and what our challenges are, and what our efforts should be, and ask whether we are meeting those efforts and doing a good job or not. We can also look at what other science academies have done, and we will see where we stand. And more about that later when we interact, in terms of possible comments later on what I have to say. So let me start by, going through where we are today in terms of the world, and I'll just put my slide on if you can see it. Can you see that?
Yes, you have to enlarge
We
it.
can see that. We can see you. We can see you.
You have to make it full screen.
I'll do that. Yeah, can you see that now?
Yes.
Excellent, good. So let's look at our future and science. And if you take a view of where we will be, in 2050, the view is rather bleak. And that view is bleak because, you can look at a planet which one, in a very dystopic way, and say that our size and demands of our population across the globe, the vagaries of climate change, the use and misuse of data, the degradation of the economy, all might make for a world which might be economically viable, but not otherwise particularly satisfying. And this is one view of the world which we can have. Now, in answering that view, we need to ask where we came from as humans and how we made the world as it today. And the answer to that question was provided in great part by these two people, Charles Darwin on the left and Alfred Russel Wallace on the right. And they pointed out that all life on Earth has a common origin, and that common origin means that all life on Earth has a shared chemistry. And we know from work later on that that shared chemistry is connected by the thread of DNA. So in trying to understand one form of life, we end up understanding another. And if you want to understand, for example, cancer, you might get an understanding of that from work, let us say, in the Indian Agricultural Research Institute undergraduate genetics lab, which discovered a gene called wingless, which is involved in many cancers. So these are the kinds of serendipitous ways by which our understanding of life has come, and it has come by us as humans taking this forward. Let's go now to today, this year, and see what has happened because of the pandemic. We have what is called a spillover, and this book by David Quammen talks about spillovers in general, how human-animal proximity results in diseases spilling over from other animals into human. This kind of proximity has increased enormously recently, and the result of that is that we are going to see more and more spillover events, and a little more about that soon. But if you look at spaceship Earth at 2050, we can ask, where are we headed in terms of various kinds of measurements which we are making today? And that can be done very precisely, largely because of the extraordinary efforts of scientists in documenting the state of the planet in multiple ways. Now, if you look at this report, there are 4 broad components we can look at from 4 different perspectives. One, from our perspective as humans. The second, as humans, examining the consequences on climate. And third, on biodiversity. And fourth, on environment. And we ask, where will we stand in all these in 2050? If you go to the big 4 advertising agencies, and this one is a report from PricewaterhouseCoopers, they will tell you 2050 is going to be really terrific. The world economy will grow more than double in size. The shifts in global economic power will mean that emerging economies like India would be very large. They could be the drivers of growth. There are extraordinary policy potentials now to make this more and more feasible, and there are extraordinary business implications and opportunities. This is the characteristic view of from economists and business. They look at the world in the way in which it drives industrialization and growth and the changing demographics of economic power. But if you look at, in terms of other projections, which climate scientists, for example, have made, and you see what global temperatures will be like in 2050, typically they would be in the heat map, there's very little light blue or blue around. We are going to have increased temperatures, which are rather substantial given the current rate of what's happening. If you look at greenhouse gas emissions, you can range that from possibilities which are very likely with strong interventions, that's shown in green, or you can look at the representative concentration pathways as you go into different alternatives, and they range over a very wide spectrum, suggesting that very strong interventions are needed. Otherwise, we're going to be in trouble in terms of greenhouse gas. Similarly, with sea level rise, again, they go over a rather large range, but that range means that countries such as Bangladesh, coastal areas in our east coast, areas in our west, such as Lakshadweep, all of them are likely to be in serious trouble. Similarly, with biodiversity, the relative apportionment of land between forestry, pasture, bioenergy, food crop, for industry, and so on, means that in countries such as the BRICS countries, compared to the rest of the world, we are going to see a reduction of green area and an increase in areas used for other purposes, and a reduction in biodiversity, which is rather substantial. Here's a picture of Sagarmatha, Mount Everest, which I took flying over on a trip to Bhutan some years ago. And it has snow, but this snow is going to be depleted rather substantially. And in 2050, we don't know how this is going to look like. Now, if you look at the historians of the future, people who look at our present and our past and extrapolate into the future, historians of the future is a polite term for astrology. And, just like you can extrapolate in various matters in science, these people put in a lot of effort and try to extrapolate what the future will look like. Of course, they extrapolate from current interventions and current situations, and they cannot predict what dramatic changes might come about. But right from Malthus to Paul Ehrlich to the Club of Rome to the IPCC, you've had very cautious, pessimistic, and dystopian views of what the future is going to look like. All of them have been countered by views of the economists of the kind I've told you, who argue that each crisis is actually only an opportunity, and you soon have human ingenuity, science, and technology coming up in a manner to solve these problems and going ahead. And therefore, life is actually getting better and better, and this gloom and doom business is completely wrong. Independent of that viewpoint about science finding solution, people such as the late Hans Rosling pointed out that actually standards of living are getting better. Countries are having, fewer, rates of population growth. There have been fewer wars, and Rosling is a great expert on collecting data and analyzing it. And he points out that, the reality is much better than what we gloomily say is the current situation. Now, in this case, what we have to look at is how we came about to our situation. And this book by Thomas Hager, The Alchemy of Air, is about the Haber-Bosch process. Now, the Haber-Bosch process captures nitrogen from the atmosphere and makes ammonia. And the pressure to do this came about when humans domesticated plants and took to agriculture in a large way. They needed fertilizer for these plants to grow, as soil was depleted from nitrogen. First, they looked at guano, bird shit from China and South America, and that helped a lot. Then they looked at nitrite mines, and that helped a lot. And when both these ran out, life was going to be really very difficult. Humans would have reached a certain limitation in their population growth because agriculture could support only so many, and only so much land could be cultivated again to give yield. What the Haber-Bosch process did was to take nitrogen from air and make ammonia, and therefore make fertilizer and also chemical weapons. And the result of that was that we were no longer limited by the capacity of the land and the soil to support growth of plants. Today, half the nitrogen in our body comes from the Haber-Bosch process. So here is an example of science and technology which dramatically changed the future of humanity. There are other ways by which science and technology has changed dramatically the future of humanity. And this is New Mexico. And this explosion, whose footprint we can still say is taken by some people to mark the start of the Anthropocene. That is the period where human beings' impact on the earth left indelibly. And I would say the Haber-Bosch process is another example. 10,000 years ago, the domestication of plants and animals could be another start point for the Anthropocene. But the fact is that the Anthropocene is on us. And as I said, since all life is connected by the thread of DNA, the Anthropocene also allowed humans, shown here are Rosalind Franklin, Maurice Wilkins, Crick, and Watson, who deciphered the structure of this connecting thread. But not only did this allow us to understand nature's engineering, how all of evolution came about, and how we learned about how we came about on this planet, but it allowed us to engineer the planet also from a biological perspective in a manner not dissimilar to how the examples I gave of engineering the planet from a chemistry or from a physics perspective. The result of all our ventures is summarized beautifully by Partha Dasgupta from Cambridge, who points out that there are enormous value which we have given the world, us as scientists and technologists, which have had consequences on the environment disproportionate to what we had imagined. One example he gives of such an invention is the chainsaw that allows forests to be felled and therefore buildings and homes to be constructed, but it also destroys the environment. Fishing in trawlers is another example. It provides food at enormous, unprecedented scale, but it drains the ocean of resources. What we are doing in these cases is paying in the future for our current quality of life. And this is the standard way by which the industrial revolutions have gone ahead. Now, today, as a consequence of climate change, for example, and the loss of biodiversity, our threats loom in multiple ways. This ability to postpone payment is no longer becoming readily feasible, and the consequences of this postponed payment are upon us in multiple ways. Here is an antelope, the Saiga antelope in Kazakhstan, very hardy, but with a high fatality every year because of the difficulties in the terrain and the environment. But one year, about a few years ago, a very large number of these antelopes died suddenly. The reason for that was deciphered in 2018. And the reason is that because of a 1.5 degree increase in summer temperature, a commensal bacterium, which was harmless in the nasal passages of this antelope, invaded the blood vessels, caused sepsis, and caused a huge number of these animals to die suddenly. So in other words, our consequences, the consequences we have had on climate change in the way we have developed can have impact on us in ways which we haven't thought through at all. A pandemic can come from a coronavirus which jumped from a bat to a human, but it can also come from bacteria resident in us, which can take on new properties because of changes in external temperature. So we need to therefore understand where we are going in terms of our science and technology and make policy changes which affect all of this. Similarly, in terms of changing global temperatures, plants have changed their location. High altitude plants, which were viable at lower temperatures, now have to deal with warmer temperatures. How do they do that? That's something which, is again being studied very intensely. Insect ranges have been studied as a consequence of climate change. The percentage of species losing more than half their range has been calculated. So all of this has come by extraordinary work by environmental scientists, climate researchers, to warn us about what can happen to insects, plants, and vertebrates. Insect abundance seems to be falling. It's not clear why and how this is happening. And we don't have enough information about why this is happening for specific species. That's another major area where enormous research is needed. Similarly, afforestation, replanting forests, has had big consequences when not done properly. Quite often, this has happened by planting non-native trees and plants in locations. Eucalyptus is an example, both in India and Argentina, but it really has affected indigenous biodiversity enormously. But all of this, if you look at what's happening, simultaneous with this, humans have relentlessly gone on again and again to develop technologies which analyze the environment and deal with what needs to be done in our environment in extraordinary ways. And this has been possible, not just by using computers now, but the brain and the machines we make have interacted enormously. So we have, on one hand, this enormous ability to have changed our lives in ways which is not imaginable for any other animal. We've had impact on the planet in ways which no other animal has had. And we've done this because the development of our brain and our body has been able to have this kind of impact on the environment. So in this situation, if you look at us from perspectives of science academies, from scientists, from science institutions, where should our science exploration focus? What should we be doing? And what should we, as fellows of science academies, be pushing for? That is the fundamental challenge we need to ask. And the honest answer is that our academies are not doing enough. As groups of scientists in India, they're not doing enough. As individuals, there may be some who are doing enough, but there are not enough individuals. And therefore, the net result of this is that policies and decision making is done in a manner which is bereft of the quality inputs which can come from these aspects which are listed, which can be working together. What are the things we need to look at? This is, a square, which there are 4 other squares. We have the known knowns, things which we are aware of and understand. We need to do a lot about those. We have the unknown knowns, which are things which we understand but are not aware of. Then we have the known unknowns, things which we are aware of but don't understand. And then finally, we have things which we have no clue about. In each of these 3 areas, except for the bottom right, and I can tell you how the bottom right needs to be addressed, we need to move ahead in rather substantial ways. So first of all, things which we are aware of and understand. These relate to many of the things I mentioned: climate, environment, biodiversity. We push a lot harder as a scientific community in an integrated manner. But what we are doing substantially is stating the problem in each of these situations and not sufficiently being involved in the answer to the problem. And this is something which, as communities, we need to change. There are institutes, there are individuals who deal with each of these, but as a coordinated aspect, we are not doing enough. So that was the first point, which is the known knowns, things which we are aware of and understand. Now let's go to the next one, which is the unknown knowns. And these are areas which we understand, but we're not aware of. Now, the deep ocean is an area which we know exists. We know there's enormous diversity, both natural and mineral, and there's great geology and biology to be done over there and great exploration. And we have not explored that enough. Incidentally, there will be a major deep ocean mission which will be launched in a few weeks from now, and in a manner similar to the next mission which I've outlined, outer space, which we do explore, but again, not enough. And we don't explore our backyards enough. We don't explore our dust and grime and dirt and rivers enough. There's enormous diversity over there. So these are complete major unknowns. We know they are there, and our explorations are very poor from a scientific perspective. They're just staring for us to be explored, and we haven't done that enough. Now let's go to things we are aware of, but we don't understand yet. And these are the known unknowns. The brain, we know that the brain is there. We know that many features of our behavior come from activity in the brain and its interaction with our body and the environment. But our knowledge about how the brain works and gives rise to all the behavior is very rudimentary, and we might even be going in a completely wrong direction. We know next to nothing about the origin of life. There are lots of very good speculations about it, but what actually happened is something which we don't know, both top down or bottom up. We know many problems in mathematics, for example, in chemistry, in physics, which are very complex, have to be tackled both from a theory and an experimental approach, and we haven't been successful in doing that. And that's the Navier-Stokes equation is one example. It's not that we're not trying, but it will be interesting to see in this aspect how we can go ahead. Finally, there is the unknown unknowns. And this is something which is fundamentally a major challenge. How do you deal with something which you are neither aware of nor do you understand it? The only way to deal with this is investing in science at the most fundamental level. By that I mean at the primary, secondary school level, knowledge in general, not just science, music, mathematics, languages, the ability to interact with each other in a civilized manner, to listen to multiple viewpoints, to learn all the tools which allow us to use logic to both make things and to understand things. All of this allows us to deal with something which we just don't know which will come about us. What are the kinds of unknowns which will come about us as citizens, as scientists, as policymakers? You just have to go back in history and see examples of what has happened, which were completely unknown to civilizations, which hit them and how they dealt with it. But the situations where you can deal with that best for the completely unexpected is to be prepared with all the knowledge you have and all the understanding you have, so that you can put things together in a very interesting and efficient manner. And this is very speculative, and we don't know. Now, what does all this mean for us in India? Today, we have a situation that 90% of our research funding goes to institutions in India where 10% of our students attend, i.e. the central government institutions, research institutions, IITs, central universities, and so on and so forth. 90% of our students go to state universities and colleges where there's little or no research at all. So one of the major roles we need to focus on is getting research into the broader ecosystem. And for that purpose, a major new national research foundation is on the anvil. Hopefully, that will raise resources to fund research in our state universities, our colleges, and also create centers of quality in our research institutions so that we have a distribution of quality science all over the country. This is something which other countries did 20, 30, 50 years ago, and not just have a few places of excellence, but have many. And that's the kind of thing which we need to do very rapidly. Let's see if we can do that. So this is a very important connect, bringing all of India into science in a larger way, rather than all of India contributing to science in a small number of institutions. The second aspect which we need to address very strongly, and I would like to congratulate the Academy for electing its first woman president, is that we need to see women in greater number in leadership roles. And this is a challenge all over the world, of course, but it's a particular challenge in India where there are many, many different kinds of diversity requirements which need to be in place. But this is one which cuts across all of them, and therefore proactively I would say that we need to push this. I know that sometime in the 1980s or early 1990s, the Indian Academy of Science had a push on expanding its fellowship and also expanding women in its fellowship. But these pronouncements are not easily translated into action, and it's always a bit disheartening to see how when these pronouncements are taken to a discussion table, the results are not very different from what were there earlier. So that's something which we need to change. So I'd like to stop here and conclude by saying that today's world is a world which we've created in a strange way by assuming that every problem can be solved by the creation of a solution which creates new problems and which can be solved. But there have been dramatic changes along the lines I've told you, which have impacted climate as well as biodiversity and our environment in unimaginable ways. But also because of our increasing development of data and its use in multiple ways, there's an increasing asymmetry of power through the ownership of knowledge. Knowledge and power have always gone together in human history, but today, the extraordinary distillation of various kinds of application from knowledge means that this asymmetry has grown in enormous ways. And therefore, this connection between India and Bharat, this connection to have women in leadership position, and this connection of the ability to have an understanding of every aspect of science on a more general level is very, very important. There, the academies need to play a very strong role. We should go back and look at the website of our academy, compare it to the best academies in the world, go back to our website of our academy and see during the last 1 year, 2 years, 5 years, 10 years, what we have published in any of these areas or stimulated publication in any of these areas compared to other academies, and see where the first port of call is when anyone has a problem in science and technology. Do they call up the president of the academy, or do they call up the director of an IIT next door? We have greatly devalued the role of the academy in every aspect of our public life, and it's time that we regain. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Vijay, for a fascinating talk. Kind of a reminding of that we have not been doing very well as academies, and I think there's room for improvement always. I would wish we had a longer dialogue, but the time is not sufficient. May I request Dr. Geti Hassan now to read the formal citation, and thank you very much for coming and joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Singhvi. So, the Chandrasekhar Venkatraman Medal is one of 4 general medals of the Academy. The medal was established in 1979 to commemorate the memory of distinguished fellow and Nobel laureate Sir C.V. Raman. It is awarded once in 3 years to a scientist for outstanding contributions in any branch of science. It is my great pleasure to announce that the medal for the year 2019 has been awarded to Professor K. Vijay Raghavan, Fellow of the National Academy, Principal Scientific Advisor, Government of India, New Delhi. He is the former Secretary of Department of Biotechnology, India, and also former Director of the National Center for Biological Sciences. Professor Vijay Raghavan's research primarily focused on the important principles and mechanisms that control the nervous system and muscles during development, and how these neuromuscular systems direct specific locomotor behaviors. This was achieved by using the fruit fly Drosophila melanogaster as a model system. Professor Vijay Raghavan is elected fellow of all 3 Indian Science Academies. He is a foreign associate of the European Molecular Biology Organization, an elected fellow of the Royal Society in 2014, and a foreign associate of the US National Academy of Sciences. He is also a recipient of the Distinguished Alumnus Award of IIT Kanpur, the S.S. Bhatnagar Award, a J.C. Bose Fellowship, Jawaharlal Nehru's Birth Centenary Lecture of INSA in 2007, and the Jawaharlal Nehru Lecture Award 2008. He was conferred the Padma Shri in 2013 and is also a recipient of the Infosys Prize in the Life Sciences category in 2009. Professor K. Vijay Raghavan was elected to the Fellowship of the Indian National Science Academy in 1999. Congratulations, Vijay, on behalf of all INSA fellows.
Thank you, Geti, and thanks, everybody.
Professor Singhvi, you have to unmute.
Yes. It is my pleasure to welcome Professor Ashutosh Sharma now, the Secretary Department of Science and Technology. And I would request Professor Chandrima Saha to formally welcome Professor Ashutosh Sharma on behalf of the Academy.
A very warm welcome to you, Professor Sharma. It is indeed a great pleasure to have you with us today. And I will give a brief introduction to Professor Sharma. He is Secretary, DFT, Government of India, and is internationally acclaimed for his pioneering research work in the areas of colloids, thin film interfaces, addition patterning in fabrication and application of self-assembled nanostructures. Professor Sharma was conferred the Shanti Swarup Bhatnagar Prize in 2002 and the Herdelia Award for Indian Institute of Chemical Engineers in 2003. Frederick Wilhelm Bessel Award for Alexander von Humboldt Foundation in 2006, Distinguished Alumnus Award of the IIT Kanpur and Sunny Buffalo. He was also awarded the J.C. Bose Fellowship, Infosys Prize in Engineering and Computer Science, Tuas Science Prize, S.H. Zahir Medal, and Meghnad Saha Medal of INSA. He's a fellow of all the 3 Academies of India and the World Academy of Sciences. He was elected to the fellowship in the year 2004 and served in the council during 2014 to 16. A very warm welcome to you, Professor Sharma, and I invite you to talk, and congratulations for being here.
Thank you, Professor Chandrima Shaha and Professor Vijay Raghavan, Professor Govardhan Mehta, who gave other lectures today. I see lots of friends here and all the distinguished fellows who are listening to us, as well as younger scientists who may be with us participating in this dialogue. I will take a moment to remember Professor Nasima, who was a scientist that we want all scientists to be. Not only was he a great scientist, of course, that he did everything in the area in which he worked, but that he was also a great institution builder, a great administrator, and to spread the knowledge that he had in mentoring so many young people all the time. So has had a very great impact. So it's just that when I recall science and scientists, may I request that we mute ourselves unless we are ready to speak? Thank you so much. Please just take a moment to see that we are okay. Great. Yeah, there's no feedback now. Um, so, when we think about scientists and science in this millennium, I think about, if I look at contemporary scientists, certainly Professor Nasima is one of the foremost figures that comes to my mind. I have had the good fortune of interacting with him for the last 10 years, more intensely last 6 years, when even until a couple of months ago, he was chairing several committees of DST, and he was doing that so effectively. So this is something that we would do well to understand the life and times of great scientists like him. Um, just about a week or two ago, I gave a lecture on Acharya Jagdish Chandra Bose and his life and times and their relevance in today's world for science and scientists. And so I could read up a lot of stuff about uh, uh, Jagdish Chandra Bose that I had kind of forgotten, and all the stuff that he said under different circumstances, under context, which is more than 100 years old now. But, when you look back, you say, hey, science actually has come a full circle, because things that made total sense back then have again started to make sense. And so there are so many of them. We heard Professor Vijay Raghavan, such a compelling lecture, exceptional in pointing out the lights and shadows of science and technology. So if you look every technology, of course, it solves some problem. It's likely to produce another set of problems for which then we have to find solutions. These solutions could be of two kinds. They could be either solutions which are technological in nature, or they could be solutions which go beyond technology, because these shadows of technology are not really directly derived from technology, but it's interaction with the society. So, in other words, to look for these solutions, these solutions may be found in the culture, they may be found in policies, they may be found in laws, but also in general, the consciousness of people and the industry, which is prevalent in those times. Now, you see, while we assume that science and technology is something which evolves on its own, of course, it evolves in our labs, it evolves in our minds, but a whole lot of it is actually shaped by the world in which we live. So, therefore, so while I would not talk here about a particular area of research or a particular technology or even a particular problem, there are certain things which are common to doing science. And if we look at the architecture of doing science, if we look at the structure of doing science, if we look at the processes of doing science. And as scientists is something that all of us are involved in. So if we focus little bit on those aspects, while the contents of a particular research, the contents of a particular science or a problem are very important, there is something which underlies all of it, and which may even be more universal. And that something which is more universal then translates into the kind of science and technology and innovation that we put out. So I would share a few thoughts about these processes, the architecture, the structure of doing science, if you would. Now, the first point is if we look at, well, what is the how science and technology evolves with the industry and the economy of the times in which we live. It's very clear that Industry Zero was driven by the movement, the transport and use of muscle, which means the brute force, the barbarians, and so on. Industry One put in place the steam power, and that basically means the rise of centralized industry, a big industry, because steam power cannot be distributed very easily. The Industry Two, so basically coal-driven industry and stuff, Industry One, and which means that there was a very huge disruptions and adjustments to the rise of that industry. It would be very hard to imagine today, just like now with the rise of Industry 4 and Industry 3, people who were living just 30 years ago, if you were to transport them totally and just miss the period in between, it would be so disruptive that it would be nearly unimaginable. I don't know whether it is unknown, known, anyway, or known, unknown, unknown, unknown. Everything pushed sufficiently far in the future becomes unknown, unknown. And so, therefore, one has to be, as Dr. Vijay Raghavan said, be fully prepared for it. And there are ways to be fully prepared for it. But anyway, Industry 2 was the rise of electrical power, and therefore, machines got into our lives and our homes. And so that gave rise to all kind of engineering. It gave rise to all kind of sciences, applied sciences, and so on, which matched the expectations of the industry. The Industry 3 happened in our lifetime, which is the rise of passive digital. Passive digital, well, communication, computing, everything which I can put in my pocket. But it's passive digital because it does not permeate my life in an intimate way. It is still something that I control, a little bit different from me. It doesn't make a whole lot of decisions autonomously and implement them. So it still relies on me to make those decisions, or at least to vet or approve those decisions, and then go about implementing it. Industry 4.0 becomes more autonomous because if we look at the future of science and technology, it's all about convergence and integration and synthesis. So while in between, we have created many compartments of knowledge. And these compartments of knowledge came about, they were not there 100 years ago at the time of Jagdish Chandra Bose, any of these people. But we created these compartments of knowledge in response to the needs of industry, economy, and society. Also, in particular, the needs of undergraduate teaching. So this is how it happened. But now it is clear that the push is again back to synthesis of the compartments that we created. A very simple, good example is the rise of intelligent machines. So rise of intelligent machines basically simply means that we are looking at a machine which is pretty much, if you were to look at it as a black box, it mimics a human being. So in terms of input-output relationship, it mimics totally a human being for certain functions. And with the rise of general artificial intelligence, the hope is, or the objective is, that it would start mimicking human beings in many different aspects, not in a particular sector, in a particular kind of decision making, but in very varied aspects. So, which means it integrates knowledge from different areas of knowledge and then apply them to a new situation. So basically, a cyber physical system or a thinking machine is an integration of communication. It is brings in perception through sensors. It brings in data, information, and knowledge which is required for a particular function or solving a problem. Then, while it works with machine learning, artificial intelligence to make a decision based on big data. Now, this having made this decision, it can also autonomously implement it through the arms and legs and actuators. So basically, in a nutshell, Industry 4.0 is all based on this philosophy. And so therefore, it has an impact on our doing of science and technology. And basically what it means is no longer sufficient that I be a chemist or a physicist of a certain kind, or a mechanical engineer or electrical engineer or a communication engineer or whatever. So those are all very good for teaching undergraduates, for them to get a sense of identity and for them to get a job. So there is a piece of paper which say I'm electrical engineer, which means I have done these 40 courses which are prescribed in that curriculum. But it is not sufficient and would become even less sufficient to solve problems that arise today and of the future. So now there are there are some lessons, of course, that we have learned from COVID-19 times about look what happens, what is the relation between science, technology, and the product and the market. Now, some of these lessons have been very compelling, and they all came very, very fast because the future is coming at us at ever faster and faster rate. Just 6 months ago, everything was imported, whether it's ventilator, diagnostic kits, whether it's PPEs, whether it's N95 mask. I had no clue about the therapy or vaccines and stuff. But a whole lot of these things have come up so quickly. It's really, really illuminating as to how it all happened. So it happened because there was a common purpose. There was a co-ownership of that common purpose, and that purpose was clear and present and urgent. So basically, what it required is the scientists, R&D labs, academia, industry, startups, and the government working together with this shared vision and purpose. Now, I suspect that this actually can happen. It's actually much easier than we think. Because as a scientist, I never really thought that my research is going to go anywhere. I always thought that this is going to stay with my publications and my patents and so on, because I really had no clue as to how to take it to the next step. But many of these things are now emerging with much greater clarity about what really happens in the whole process of transformation of knowledge through different stages of its manipulation, flow, and transformation. So now, first thing I would like to share that because here INSA is really a collection of all the top scientists, very deep brains, and there are certain things that we could do collectively. So those are in terms of education, those are in terms of research, those are in terms of processes of doing research, if you would. As I said, about the structure and processes, not so much about the outcome of a particular research, but the tools by which we do research, the culture by which we do research. So the first thing I would often talk about is the relation, or in fact, the difference between invention and innovation. Now, I recall that more than 10 years ago, there was a CSIR committee that talked about making a new Bhatnagar Award in innovation. Now, this committee had 3 different meetings, and we could not arrive at any consensus about how to judge innovation. If we cannot quantify it in any possible way, then we cannot have an award in it because it would be too subjective. And so that is why this award never came to be. Over time, I really looked into this problem very deeply and said, is it possible to differentiate invention and discovery from innovation? And moreover, can we quantify these rather unequivocally? Of course, invention and discovery we have already quantified in some ways. maybe in good way, bad way, ugly way, very hard to tell, because invention basically is generating new knowledge, which means that this is what universities do, academies do, R&D labs do, colleges do, IITs do, is basically to produce new knowledge. And of course, also transmit that knowledge in a passive way to other people. But essentially, the purpose of research is to develop that new knowledge, and this is what we call invention. Now, it is clear, of course, the invention we have been judging, especially for academic fellowships. We judge them by H index, we judge them by citations, we judge them by impact factors of journals, and which is all very good, which is a very vast area, and of course there are very polarized views about these things, which is also good. Of course, in that particular arena, it is possible to bring a balance. It is possible not to discard any data, any quantitative measure that judges the impact of invention as reflected in papers, patents, H index, and so on, citations, but basically to build upon it. Because the other view is look, that we only need to focus on quality and we can totally discard all the numbers. So it's basically something between total subjectivity and total objectivity, if you would. And the truth is that the truth is a mixture, like everything else, is a balance between the two. So, for example, one could start as a base layer, all the quantitative indicators, but then look at, as an expert, into those papers and see whether the numbers are basically false positives or false negatives. So therefore, it is possible to judge by this higher order analysis, if you would, whether numbers are truly reflective of the quality and impact which is there. So anyway, it's a combination. But I'll quickly come to the second point, which is how do we judge innovation? Now, if you think about it, well, invention and innovation, in fact, are orthogonal to each other. In fact, they flow in opposite directions. So, therefore, all our measures by which we judge creation of knowledge are not the right yardsticks for judging the use of knowledge. So, innovation basically takes as input the knowledge, and what it produces, the output, are the new socio-economic opportunities, including number of jobs generated, including impact on economy, impact on all of these socio-economic opportunities, if you would. So you see, it's very clear, it's very simple. Invention takes in money and produces knowledge. Innovation, on the other hand, takes the knowledge and produces money. I mean, I don't want to put it in such a crude way, but essential idea is that we can clearly differentiate the flow of knowledge in these two processes. And in fact, it's even easier to quantify innovation than it is to quantify invention. So I haven't any doubt that it is possible to have, in fact, a Bhatnagar Award or any other award for that matter in innovation. And that certainly should be there, because if you think about, you see, we talk about sustainability, we talk about we talk about using science to create new opportunities. So sustainability of knowledge lies in invention and innovation working together as a seamless whole. So invention is one half of the circle. If you think about the circle of knowledge, the innovation is the other half of the circle. So it comes full circle when it goes through invention and innovation. In other words, we took some resources, generated knowledge. Hopefully, this knowledge has a direction and relevance. If it has direction and relevance, it would generate through innovation new socio-economic opportunities. And then it comes full circle. So it is very important for our younger people here to understand that much of our education, much of our research, and everything else that we do hinges on our understanding of the processes of invention, but it has very little connect with the processes of innovation. So this is just to keep in mind. And as a culture, how would that come? It's certainly, it is a shared responsibility for all of us, whether it is academies, whether it is a teacher, whether it's a student, whether it's a university, and so on. While it is true that the consumption of knowledge is not equal responsibility of the same people who produce knowledge. Totally agree with that. This is somewhat asymmetric. But at the same time, there has to be a push for the knowledge. There has to be a hunger to push that knowledge so that it can be matched with the pull for the knowledge, which means that the consumption of knowledge. Now, other aspect, of course, thing that comes to my mind, because when we talk about the future, of course, we are often talking about what we call interdisciplinary, multidisciplinary, transdisciplinary, or out of disciplinary. These are words that become a little bit fashionable in last 20 years. Now, what I would like to argue, in fact, is that all of this is very misleading, totally. Now, the reason it is misleading is because it is based on a misconception of what actually it all means. Now, you see, multidisciplinary, interdisciplinary, and so on are required to solve problems. And we know that there are problems of water, health, transport, so on, climate change, as was pointed out by Dr. Vijay Raghavan, environment, health. All of these are multidisciplinary problems, no doubt, because the way we define discipline. So our mistake, in fact, is our fundamental mistake, which happened in the last 1 century or so, is to actually define very watertight compartments of knowledge that we call discipline. Now we suddenly come to a point that we need to solve a problem. So when you want to solve a problem, the only way to actually describe the way to solution is to say, oh, I will be interdisciplinary, I will be multidisciplinary, and so on. But imagine if there were actually, we didn't have a concept of discipline, then we are focused on the problem. We are not focused on discipline. Other words, there are two ways of doing science, and it becomes increasingly that we do science by what I call tool-centric approach, which is totally different from what you may call problem-centric approach. Now, this tool-centric approach has become culturally, it has a very deep root in terms of the structures that we have in universities, IITs, and everywhere. What it means is that we are department-centric, essentially. No matter how many directors talk about multidisciplinary and so on, when I ask them a simple question, I say, look, I know this guy who did his undergraduate in physics and he did PhD in chemical engineering. And while, he had done great postdocs, he's a permanent job in US. He has more citations and stuff than any average faculty member in department XYZ in IITs, wherever. Would you hire him as a faculty member? It's a tough question. It'd be very hard to hire this person as a faculty member because neither physics department nor chemical engineering would actually be able to identify with this person. So that there is a very deep flaw in the way we hire and promote people. So while it remains our desire to be multidisciplinary and interdisciplinary, having created very rigid boundaries for these disciplines, having created totally impermeable boundaries for these disciplines, it becomes nearly impossible to be able to appreciate people who are truly, truly multidisciplinary and, in fact, have done great work through that multidisciplinary tools. So, in fact, it is time to think about what kind of new structures, in fact, would be required. And it has to go much beyond the lip service. So, it is not simply about creating, another division or something or a committee for interdisciplinary fellows, for example, which degenerates into what we all know, the fact that if a person is rejected from everywhere, okay, then it's just put in that particular bin of interdisciplinary something, right? The fact is that the so-called interdisciplinary and multidisciplinary have to come really at top, and not as a not as a as a default, but not as a reject, if you would. So this is deeply cultural. So rest of the time, that I have at my disposal, I would only talk about the deep cultural aspects of how we do science, how do we do technology, what are the structures that we have our disposal for this. Now, whole lot we know. So let me conclude this part by saying that while we are totally, totally good, have become good as a nation, and as very deep minds in science about the processes of invention. We are not equally comfortable with processes of innovation. And that's reflected in everything we do. For example, training of our PhD students. Now, imagine this PhD student, I've often wondered with my own experience. Now, he has gone through blackboard teaching most of his life, a passive education when you read up things and you crack exams. And here we put him in the lab and saying, look, now you generate new creative knowledge. You generate knowledge which is relevant, which is profound, which is not incremental, for example, right? And this fellow, he didn't even know how to write a paper. Nobody told him about ethics. Nobody told him that you take some stuff and not, just paste it there, or what are the different ethical dimensions here. We never said how to write a good paper. We never said what makes for a profound research. What is about taking risk? Totally, what happens is PhD students come, they join a group, and then the senior students tell them what to do, how to do it. And if you do this, then you would get your PhD without any problem in 3, 4, 5 years, right? Why generate friction of any kind? So therefore, it is very necessary that there be a structured training, if you would. What is the minimum basic things required to train a PhD student? Other thing we see is that oftentimes PhD students are in fact an extension, a kind of semi-clone of the mentor. This is very dangerous because while the mentor is totally into academia and paper publishing, the expectations from PhD student may be, in fact, for a majority of them, maybe of a different kind. Because we know that globally, less than 10% PhDs find job in academia. So it is obvious. It is a tautology. It is so self attested truth that the PhD students that we would be producing cannot simply be produced only for academia and only for deep research. Not everybody's personality and potential is in consonance with that. So if we try to fit everybody in that particular mold, it's going to produce nothing but disaster. It's also a disaster because a whole lot of these PhD students actually have no idea about innovation, and they are actually not prepared. They have not even explored anything about working, for example, in industrial R&D, or to have their own startups, or to have their own businesses. So it's a very linear progression going from undergraduate to PhD to postdoc, and then forever looking for a job, which is very, very frustrating. Totally. I see so many of those people. They say, "Oh, government made me do PhD, then they made me do postdoc, then you made me such and such fellow. Now you produce a job for me," and uh, they are totally justified in making this demand because they have seen nothing else. They have been groomed as paper producing machines, and we have not had expectations for their overall development, whether it is in terms of very strong communication skills, whether it is in terms of problem solving, even outside of their immediate domain of knowledge and expertise, so to say. Then there's a whole lot of things. We know that India now is number 3 in producing number of scientific papers. But then, of course, now it's time that we have done good in quantity, given all our constraints, that we now focus totally on the quality. So we focus totally on quality, relevance, and direction, which means not simply saying that great university XYZ, this is what is fashionable, this is what is hot. So I'm going to be doing the same. Now, our inspiration has to come from us. And there are certain things, for example, there are new problems, okay, that, the rest of the world doesn't care and they would never look at it. But those are creative scientific problems. And so, therefore, understanding those problems and taking them forward is totally our business. There are other things, for example, when we talk about scientific problem solving, this is in terms of 3 different ways you can solve a problem. And this is to introduce to younger people about how we think about problem solving. This in Hindi, we would call it Jugaad, Dhanda, and Panga. Now, see, Jugaad basically is the wrong way of solving a problem because it's not scalable. and it is not optimal. So sometimes we do that because of constraints, but it's okay. We solve the problem for today and say die another day. Fine. The dhanda basically means business as usual, which is an incremental research. Happens, for example, I did a lot of research in fluid mechanics, and I would often see papers which say, look, I have solved the problem in these three corners. The fourth corner is still open. So I would use similar tools and stuff, and I would again solve that problem and I would publish it. Perfectly okay. I mean, one gets a PhD, maybe look for a job and stuff. Um, but we have to make sure, as teachers, academy fellows, at least 20% of our scientists are doing something that you call panga, which means high risk research and disruptive research. And this is what is all going to be about the future. Because a future, you see, as was pointed out, the industry 4.0 is not based only on controlling the movement, the flow of materials and energy. It is all about controlling the flow of information and knowledge. So it doesn't matter where the manufacturing is. We already know that. It doesn't matter where the manufacturing is. It doesn't matter where the science is being produced. All of that doesn't matter. It is the ownership of that data, information, and knowledge, which is so critical in order to use science and technology going forward in the future. And so we already see the examples of that. In fact, data and information has become the new raw material. And Indian society as a whole, including our scientists, we have never had any respect for raw material. So we always said raw material is cheap. We will export it. Somebody will do what is called value addition and sell it back to us million times over. Now data and information is that raw material, and we must not be. We must be totally be sure, certain, and confident that this is the stuff we are going to build on, and it's not simply somebody coming in and selling plastic, giving plastic against giving gold, which is what the history is replete with those examples. So this would happen when we understand that the future is basically driven by knowledge and its consumption. So knowledge, which is direction which is relevant, and the mechanisms for its consumption to produce, in fact, new knowledge, to produce other opportunities. Okay. So you see, so we talk about the fact that I think a lot more needs to be done in terms of bringing some structure into our training of scientists for research, like PhD training. I'm totally convinced that it takes several years before our PhD students really understand what is this beast called research, right? If most of them don't even know what an error bar looks like. Perhaps they do in science or some areas of science, but they certainly don't know in many areas of engineering about what is the error analysis. And certainly the experimental aspects are so hugely missing because pretty much all the school labs have been shut down because they don't help you crack exams. And it is also true that on undergraduate level and so on, our familiarity with doing good experiments and design of experiments is really an alien concept for a very large number of people. And that also comes to mind in addition to these compartments of disciplines. In fact, I had not realized it until I talked to some physicists about 30 years, 25, 30 years ago. Many of them were saying, look, I'm a theoretical physicist. The others were saying, I'm an experimental physicist. And the theoretical physicist I was talking to, he wanted to do some experiments to prove his theory. And I said, and he said, can you do it? Because they thought that I'm an engineer, so I can do experiment something, right? It occurred to me that this was such a simple experiment that a high school kid should be able to do it, really. Okay, so I tried to convince this person, a very top physicist, that look, it's not necessary for you to outsource this, that you can actually rig it up in your lab and do it overnight. But somehow I was not able to convince, because then I realized that somehow we are taught in such a way, we are so deeply conditioned that we are saying, look, that there is this thing about no, this is theory, and I do theory. and I can do experiments and so on. There is also a lot of friction that we have needlessly introduced in our way of doing science. That another point of friction that I see is the distance between what we call basic science and what we call applied science and what we call, well, transforming it into some useful form. Fact of the matter is that most of the science we do today is a spectrum, of course, but most of it is what you would call applied science. And in fact, it would be clear by looking at the introduction, the first opening paragraph of most of the papers. So they would say, hey, if this science, I'm doing this science because that this would have great use in this A, B, C, D, E, F, G. But okay, that's where we stop. So there could be, most of the science we do today have very applied elements in it. The whole question is whether we understand and are able to transform those elements to go to the last mile connectivity to see that those elements are in fact transformed. It does not remain a mere lip service for our funding proposals, that for our papers that we write, and so on. And I think it is possible to do it if we are sure that this is what we want to do. So we don't lack intelligence, certainly not. So it is deeply cultural. It is deeply cultural because I know that even the top scientists in country XYZ, even the scientists who get Nobel Prize, they are from the beginning thinking about the knowledge that they are producing, how they are going to be consuming it. And they have no shame in this. There is no shame in it, of course. So this is deeply cultural. That either we say that, look, I'm not really equipped to do it, or I say, look, is it really my job to do it, or that is not desirable to do it. Okay, so these are the three things which are deeply cultural, and I think that it doesn't matter. I may be 60 years old; it may be too late for me, but to explain it very clearly and very compellingly to our younger colleagues and especially people that we mentor, without mincing any words about it. Um, Now, other point that I talked about, science communication, very important. And there are many different new programs, even DST has launched in order to inculcate science communication, which is not only about writing good logical papers, but also communicating your science to other people who may not even have a background in science. This is very important because this, you go looking for a job after PhD, if you go to a corporate, if you go to industry, all of that, and you just put down your papers on the table, no matter if there are 20 of them and no matter what the impact factor is, people would just laugh at it. They're not, because the value systems in these worlds are very different. And we must start understanding and appreciating those value systems. There's nothing wrong with any of these value systems. It's just that they serve different needs. And not everybody is cut out for each of these, but some have to work here, some have to work there. Um, Now, of course, I would kind of conclude. I think we are getting there in terms of time. So, the processes of doing science, architecture, structure, and processes of doing science. In terms of, if we look at, we already said our future challenges are in terms of sustainable development, in terms of climate, in terms of environment, in terms of rise of intelligent machines that are going to displace people more and more. This is very widespread impact of science and technology in everything that we do. Now, how do we do science, which is in fact seamless? So this question has occupied my mind for many years. And what I mean by doing seamless science, what do I mean by doing holistic science? How do we bring that in? I'm not talking about on the level of individual. An individual scientist can rarely be holistic and seamless. Right? We have to look at the strengths of a person rather than the weaknesses. But system as a whole has to be holistic and seamless. And so, okay, now I'll give you an example. One of the problems that we face in doing science, I had faced it all my life, is that so in terms of flexibility of doing science. So if you have some funding from somewhere, let's say DST, whatever, then you say, oh, how can I plan my research to the last decimal place? Then it is not research, it is road building. So I cannot say, look, at some point I need consumables more. Sometimes something broke down, I need this, but there is no such flexibility. So once you have a capital budget, once you have a consumables budget, salary budget, they are non-negotiable, right? Which is totally silly. Second aspect is the flexibility. I mean, not flexibility, but in terms of uh, any big project or a center or what we call mission being seamless. What do you mean by that is we always we create centers, which we say are centers of excellence and so on. And they are basically focused on R&D, even less of D than R. Now, we think about, look, then we say we create another structure which would develop technology, another structure which will do translation, another structure that would do human resources or specialized human resources in that area. Then we say there would be another specialized structure that we call incubator. And this is going to have these technology startups and so on. Yet another specialized structure, which is called a research park, for example, in IIT Madras, which is a front end for the industry and connect to the marketplace. All of this is so highly fragmented that really there is very little hope of exchange between all of these compartments. So now a new mission on cyber physical systems that DST launched last year addresses all of these problems 100%. So, and that would also be the template for all the science and technology missions going in the future. This is a very exciting example because the cyber physical systems is pretty much everything that is starting now, but it will have no end. It has a beginning. But this is something that this entire future of humanity, as long as you can see it in the future. So what is it? Is artificial intelligence, machine learning, robotics, industry 4.0, and the data sciences and application of all of that in everything that we do, whether it is health, education, transport, energy, water, what have you. Okay, so how do we do this? So here's the new concept of a hub. Now, suppose you have a hub in machine learning. This hub in machine learning, first of all, let us say it's a what is called not-for-profit company, which is called Section 8 company. It has a board, which is totally autonomous board. It has membership from 1/3 from industry, 1/3 from line ministries that would make use of this science and technology, and 1/3 from the academia and R&D. Now, second thing it would do is it would have all the financial and administrative powers in order to, let's say, hire people at market rates, fire them when you don't want them, give money to industry, take money from industry, make MOUs with foreign players, bring people from abroad as required, bring industry as required. In fact, have co-ownership of resources with the industry. It also has its own incubator. It also has, it is basically an aggregator and custodian of all the knowledge in the country in that particular area. So even any extramural funding which is required for small projects which are distributed in that area, it should not really be with the government and ministry. It has to be with the bunch of scientists who work in that particular area. So in other words, it also has connect with the research part. So essentially, it's you generate the relevant knowledge, but you also have mechanisms for consuming that knowledge in a seamless way with the flexibility which is required for us to do our science and technology without any constraints. In fact, I am very happy to share this is such a disruptive structure that even the files for funding and release of money, they do not go through what is called the finance division of the ministry, which is something which is totally unheard of because these are all the powers which have been delegated by the cabinet itself to these hubs, right? So totally now, see the now whole point is a structure like that would succeed if we have the right vision and leadership in our scientific community, which is managing that hub. So no longer would we be able to point fingers somewhere else. If we succeed or if we fail, or a mixture of the two, is entirely because of who we are culturally and what we are able to do with it, right? And so, for example, another big mission on quantum technology is coming up, which is worth 8,000 crores, and is going to follow the same structure and processes. Just think about it. You see, the quantum technology is there something like, well, I don't know, unknown, unknown, some aspects of it, a combination of all of it, right? So it requires generating very profound new knowledge that's understood. But if we are going to say, look, how we are going to use that knowledge, there is no academic place in the country that can convert that knowledge into a 50 qubit quantum computer. So if we are going to do business as usual, that is not going to happen. Or there is no place which is going to be using this knowledge in order to have secure communication, quantum communication over a length of few hundred kilometers, or coming from the satellite. All of this requires that we involve industry in a strong way as equal partners, so that finally the knowledge that we have generated finds its fulfillment by producing, whether it's a computer, whether it is secure communication, whether it is all of that. And so what I'm trying to impress upon is saying that all of our science technology missions ought to be seamless, in which people are equal partners. They are not, there is nobody saying, look, I am more important than you are. If I'm producing basic knowledge, I'm producing deep knowledge, the knowledge which is required in order to solve our problems, then we get equal respect and we are equal partners in all of this. All right. So now many of these things would be reflected in the science, technology, and innovation policy, which is coming up very fast. So in the next 2 months or so, that we should be able to notify it. Many of the things, the aspects that we talked about the mechanisms, about the structure, about the processes, about the architecture of doing science and technology in its very many different aspects, because the stakeholder base of science and technology is not only limited to scientists. It's certainly not limited only to what we call research scientists. So therefore, how do we empower everybody who makes use of science and technology, whether it is industry, whether it is startups, whether it is farmers. And of course, we talked about the fact that diversity, inclusion, and equity are very important aspects. And so all of that is going to find a very strong place in the policy. In fact, the last policy, if you think about it, was only 2013. So people would often ask, do we need a new science, technology, innovation policy? The answer is very simple, without any comparison. 10 years ago, I mean, the future today comes at us at such a much faster pace than it ever did before. 10 years ago, even the concept of what we call innovation, startups, and so on was not very deeply understood and promoted. Similarly, the new challenges that come, that of sustainable development, climate, clean energy, clean water, we are going to run out of water very soon for sure. Whether it is the new technologies of cyber physical systems, the new technologies of quantum technologies, and so on, all of that is happening at really breakneck pace. Is happening exponentially, and that's why they're called exponential technologies, disruptive technologies. So what it means is that we need to do a little bit of reimaging of our education, our skills, our training, especially in the area of research, and our expectations from what science and technology is going to produce for us. So then, in terms of, since we are talking about culture, and this would be the last point that I would like to share, everything that I have shared is basically, you see, this is not any final view even from my side. These are points that one would like people to debate, to at least have some kind of understanding about where we are, who we are, where are we going, what may be the total, different directions in which we are going. Dr. Vijay Raghavan talked about democratization of science, which is another part of the future of science, which is just one aspect of it. You see that we produce knowledge and then we disseminate that knowledge through scholarly scientific journals. What is the future of publishing? This is a very serious question that we have to ask ourselves. There are many different futures. It's not very clear what the future is. Of course, if I go sufficiently far in future, I can't see the immediate future. If you go sufficiently far in future, the future of doing science and future of publication are very intimately tied with the rise of artificial intelligence. You see, in our times, my time, when I was doing PhD, I used to read 3 journals, and that gave me all the information I needed in my area of research. Very soon, it's going to become impossible for a single human mind to keep track of all the important advancements which are happening. So it is going to be done, I haven't any doubt, not an iota of doubt, it is going to be done by machine learning. So essentially, whole lot of stuff which is scanned, and what is really relevant, very small subset of that is to be presented to me. Whole lot of scientific research itself, which is based on pattern recognition, is going to be done by machine learning. We already have recent examples. For example, the structure of folded proteins. Now, this is a very super hard problem to be done manually. Whole lot of those problems, whether it's crystallography, whether, a whole lot of these things. Basically, a whole lot of science is finding a universality, a pattern in big amount of data. So, for example, if we knew all the motions of planets over a century or so, from there I should be able to deduce, for example, certain laws of motion. And this can be done much faster and much easier by a thinking machine made for pattern recognition than by a human mind. So we increasingly in the future, we would have to ask the question as scientists, not even as scientists, as human beings, about what is really special about us. What is it that we can do that a machine cannot do better? And I think it is time that we started pondering over these questions. It's never too early because future is really getting here very fast. So final point that I want to talk about is we are thinking about science and technology for Atmanirbharta, which is Atmanirbharta is not simply a surface meaning of it. I'm not simply saying every a nut, bolt, and screw is to be produced by us. That's not the sense of Atmanirbharta. Atmanirbharta also is not related only to one aspect of knowledge chain. It is all the way Atmanirbharta in independent thinking, in education, in R&D, in innovation, in technology, in market. And all of this cannot be viewed in isolation with each other. This would be a big mistake. We have been doing that all along. We are saying, am I Atmanirbhar in this particular compartment? We may be. We may be Atmanirbhar in producing papers, for example, but we are not Atmanirbhar in integrating those papers with the rest of the ecosystem, so to say. So Atmanirbharta, and this is very true of Atmanirbharta in producing a very thinking, very deep thinking scientist of the future, that this cultural aspect of Atmanirbharta, it rides on 3 cultural pillars which are very deep and sometimes weak. The first pillar is Atmavishwas. So there is nothing in our education, and I'm not talking about the top labs of the country, but for example, we are talking about the state universities. We are talking about a whole lot of these things. Do we have people with self-confidence? They have the intelligence. Question is, do they have the self-confidence to say that not only I can do it, but I will do it? There is absolutely no doubt about it, right? Do we have those people who have the confidence to take risk, right? And this is as much part of doing good science as having all the top class equipment in my lab, whether it is cryo microscope, whether any of that. I would actually rate this higher than any of those resources. But we are often not talking about it because there is no formal training, so it is basically from father to daughter. Right? It is our shared responsibility as a community to bring in this cultural component, because these poor fellows in high school, they are not taught self-confidence. Even in college, they are not taught self-confidence. They are not empowered. None of us actually is empowered in that compartment. How do we know that? I mean, oftentimes, and Professor Chopra is here, so we had a long talk about this. He has been inspiration to many of his students to start their companies, hugely successful companies who have produced not one job but a million jobs, right? So whenever I tried to do it with my PhD students, what I found is that they have the best of tools, best of intelligence, best of background and training, but they don't have the confidence. They say, can I really do it? No, no, I have not been trained for this. No, I don't think I can compete globally and so on. With the same fellow somewhere else in some other culture, would be so highly successful in doing it. Many of the cultures, the motto is, you may be stupid, but don't be humble. Now, our culture actually emphasizes the other extreme, right? So the best of our people is a you stupid person, can do nothing, right? So let's bring this dimension of training in a very strong way in everything that we do. And I can tell you, every time I was successful in instilling this confidence in my students, they succeeded beyond their wildest dreams. And I already knew that they would succeed. Only thing is that they need to they need to trust themselves and their abilities. The second aspect, the cultural aspect of Atmanirbharta is Atma Samman. And as a society, we are very weak on that. I've never seen two scientists unanimously praising the third one. Is absolutely, I can guarantee you that. Never happens. And this is the first scientific principle that, whether it's some material or energy, if I don't have it, I cannot give it to anybody else. It's mass conservation. So therefore, Atma Samman is something, and of course, it is something. Atma Samman means that I can respect everybody else for who they are, instead of just saying that they are no good. Okay, that absolutely, that negativity has to disappear totally, right? No matter, even if our circumstances are constrained, it doesn't really matter, because there is no life without constraints. We will never have it. Okay, so it's just no point complaining that my director is not supporting my head, my dean. If the whole world is evil and that's the reason I'm not succeeding, right? There's no such thing. Okay, the failure, we must understand that the failure is our own. If we succeed, it's because of other people. And this is a very deeply cultural issue. Unless we overcome this, we are always, pulling the best of our institutions to dust, right? And the examples are, great universities of yesteryears. We don't have to look very far. So we definitely, every student, as we taught, stay away from petty politics. Totally, totally. There's sure recipe for disaster. And so to be away from negativity. And finally, Atma Chintan. While we are too much into Atma Chinta, which is negative, a dispassionate analysis of who I am, not of other people. Other people will take care of themselves. A dispassionate analysis of who I am, what my weaknesses are, and how do we go about plugging those weaknesses, right? And this is a shared, distributed responsibility, if you would. And finally, all of that leads to what we call the scientific temper, which is another much abused word. But without scientific temper, how can we do world-class science? Scientific temper is often mistaken for scientific education and a degree. There is very little correlation between the two. Very little correlation between the two. So I would end here by just saying one final thing. Like I said again, uh, whatever I say is based on my experience and thinking. I'm not saying that, that there's anything great, but this is what I have seen as the processes that hamper our growth in science. Right? At different times, they introduce friction of very high magnitude, which people are unable to overcome, even despite the resources, the intellectual resources, infrastructural resources, everything that we have at our command. And so that final thing about scientific temper, this is so important. It's so important even for science academy, leave alone individual scientists. What is, you see, a test of scientific temper to my mind is that the test, the litmus test, is when I'm in a committee and my rational, logical decision of that committee is at odds with my self-interest. Okay, am I able to make a decision which is right? So that is the only litmus test of what I call scientific temper. So scientific temper, if we are able to inculcate in every committee, you see, there's a lot. I see so many of our young people who are totally demoralized because they did not get what they deserve. And even an independent committee may sometimes say, yes, that this was very unfair, right? So now, as scientists, as academicians, as everybody, it is our first and foremost responsibility to see. I mean, we may be wrong in our decisions, but we would never be unfair, right? We may be incorrect because to err is human, but I think if we bring in this very fair system, ethics, and everything in our scientific community and this decision making, that would go such a long way in producing great scientists, fulfilled scientists. Unless you have that fulfillment, it's very hard to do good science or great science. Thank you very much. I will stop there. Thank you.
And thank you, Professor Sharma. It was a fascinating lecture, full of hope, full of new ideas. And I'm sure there are many questions that you would like to, hopefully, like to take up. The first question that I have in the chat box is by Dr. Sharma from IIT Hyderabad. And he says that you talked about the flexibility in funding in the new missions. Would you extend the same flexibility in the existing DST projects?
It's not mine to extend. If it was mine to extend, it would have been done long time ago. This goes all the way to the Ministry of Finance. And this one has gone beyond that. Even they don't have the power to do any of what actually we are planning to do under these missions. Like I said, this is the power derived from the cabinet. Okay.
So then
yeah.
I would ask you a question that can't that power be extended to these things as well? I mean, what holds us back? We can always change the procedures. So what worries me?
What I'm saying is, no, I understand totally your worry. Totally. So I think that in the future, we must have these processes which are of this kind, and a template has been set. Nothing changes overnight. Okay, in this world, we have lived in a particular way for 5 decades, and we have to give certain things 5 years for them to happen.
Thank you.
So while we all, you see, we expect world to change overnight, I'm not able to change myself even overnight. World is a collection of very large number of principles and individuals. So it has its own inertia and its own culture and its way of doing things, right? So in that sense, yes, I mean, whatever that we could do, that we do. Whatever that no ministry actually can do, we cannot do.
Okay. There's there's one more question.
Just
is
to
that
give you an
can
example, I don't expect many people here know about what we call general financial rules, GFR. We are all
we all
confused by that, right? So in you see, you cannot even have what do you call repurposing of your resources between capital and general budget, right? You know who has the power to do that? Any ideas? In a project, if you know who has the power to do it? Parliament. So we would forever wait for the day when Parliament is going to tell you take 20 rupees from here and put it there. Right? It's not going to happen, right? Because the number of such requests would be in millions, right? If not in billions. Okay. And so I know I understand totally when people sometimes say that, look, there are constraints. I totally understand that. But now I'm going to flip the problem. And the flipping of problem is now here is a mission when you have no constraints. Now show me in 2 years what is it that you have done extraordinary by removal of these constraints, right? Are we going to come back with the same set of problems and then say, look, well, okay, I couldn't do this, right? So now you see, it totally depends now on the vision and leadership of the scientific community, because all those powers to succeed or fail have been delegated to them, right? So there is a delegation of power to succeed or to fail. Now, in order to succeed, what this will require, I'll tell you. It requires working not only in competitive mode, it requires working in the mode of cooperation. You see, this is a mode that we have never accustomed to working in, except in some, strategic ministries like DRDO, ISRO, and so on, where, we know that you have to work in teams in order to actually do something. So it's a combination of competition, which is driven by personal excellence and creativity and brilliance. And that has to be totally there. That cannot be sacrificed. Right? It's a question of balancing the individual creativity and brilliance with the cooperation which comes with teamwork for a shared purpose.
Okay, I think there's another question that you have raised a good point on the mode of recruitment across the disciplines in our academic institutions. How can we change it and how will it happen?
How can you? Well, I mean, you see that I thought that every university is autonomous. You see, even their board of IIT, what do you call the Senate, the board, all of these, they are totally reactive. They will not change it. You see, how do you change it? It's very simple. You say, look, okay, one structural solution that is possible is that you have two different parallel structures. One is for undergraduate education, which is called department. Another one is for problem solving, which is called a school. But both of them must have the same powers. So if you have a school of, let's say, I don't know, a school of something, quantum technologies, whatever, right? This school must be able to recruit, because this requires recruitment of people who work in quantum technologies, but they come from different backgrounds. You need computer scientists, you need this, you need the whole team. So they should be able to recruit and promote, right? So they must have the same powers. Basically, your judging your teaching contribution comes from department. Judging your research contribution comes from the research that you do, which is in the parallel structure, so to say. Right? But this is only one of the solutions. Basic point is, are we culturally convinced? I don't think we are culturally convinced or attuned to this idea at all. Because even now in SERB, we have PSCs which are based on organic chemistry, inorganic chemistry, physical chemistry, biochemistry, and so on, which are totally based on this classification of tools. They are not based on classification of what you solve with those tools. So of course both are, see, when basically I say something that this is a new thing that we need to do, it does not mean you demolish what is there. I'm
Okay.
not advocating.
I think we understand, but I think it's worthwhile for either academies or the DST or PSA's office to create certain kind of light charts that could look at future. There could be a future, that is how it should look at, and then everybody slowly.
They are there. For example, all the programs in DST which are based on, let's say, water energy, renewable energy, health, diagnostics, all of them are of that nature. But you see, there is a thing which is called top down, and there is a thing which is called bottom up. So I'm emphasizing, while you are emphasizing top down, I'm emphasizing here all the time bottom up. Okay, the reason I'm emphasizing it, there is a very good reason for it. The reason is that we are never talking about it. You see, so when is the responsibility of the director of an IIT? He is simply saying, no, 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 let the Ministry of Education tell me this, to do this, because his Senate would never agree to this, right? Because his board will never agree to it. They'll not agree to it because we in general as a whole don't agree to it. So it is because of that cultural aspect that is in all of us. So I'm saying, look, we are here, fellows of academy. Can we talk about what is it that academy can do about this?
Well, the academies are doing certain things like producing white papers on various aspects, which is a synthesized science is being produced, and we have done quite a few of the white papers.
I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about how do you bring, for example, let's say these twin dimensions of innovation and multidisciplinary in academy functioning, right? So while we all, we all say this is a great thing, we should do it, really we say we should do it, right? But we have no structure to match it, and we are resistant to change in that direction, right? So you see, change is the only thing which, all these structures that we have produced are not God produced structures. I think in response to changes that happen in society, we can change them.
I think we could have a working group in INSA or the academies to probably provide the structural changes, which hopefully your parliament will approve. With the easier to approve, get it approved now than ever before.
You don't need, the whole point is you don't need parliament to approve. It's only our membership that has to approve.
I will so are there any other questions anybody would like to read? I have many questions for you, Professor Sharma.
Go ahead.
But I would like to ask anybody else to ask any questions. Are there any on YouTube?
Yeah, there are two questions. The one is, what is the status of the One Nation, One Subscription? What is the present
right
status?
Now, there is no status. The status right now is that this is certainly one of the objectives, not one nation, one subscription, but democratization of all the scientific information at the cheapest possible level. So we cannot prescribe a solution before you have stated the problem. Now, this is one of the solutions, right? And a combination of solutions. Look, even another solution is, you see, we had this, what do you call, repositories, right? Wherein people, before they publish something, can submit it to these repositories, which is free to access by anybody. Why do you think we have failed in these repositories? Why are they not able to build and serve the function for which they were created? You see, it requires a little bit of analysis. I have some thoughts. So I will tell you just very quickly two thoughts as to why they have failed. The first one, that because you cannot cite papers from there, right? You will always cite a paper which has been published. So it's a preprint. Now, for example, if we were to link these preprints with the final citation of its published paper, then every time I cite this, actually I'm citing, I'm linking. So even though people may not have access to the published material, they have access to this preprint. But you can actually correlate the two, right? That whatever was published in this journal, in this coordinates, they actually correspond back to this preprint. So you are able to, anybody can go there and read the paper. We should make it mandatory for everybody to have this preprint made mandatory, right? And this will be okay. Nobody loses anything because they can link it with the final publication, right? Second aspect is that all of these platforms, they don't offer anything attractive to the people who are contributing to it. Why do we go to Web of Science? Why do we go to Scopus? We pay a huge amount of money to these people because they provide you tools, right? Based on which actually you gain something out of it. So why not actually prepare a platform which is even more empowered than the commercial platform which are there? In fact, not only for India, our ambition today must be global, which means even other people from abroad come and put their preprints there. And we connect it with the final published manuscript. And we offer, machine learning, artificial intelligence, all these tools for doing the statistics, for doing analysis, and all for free, right? So it is an open platform, just like Linux. So it can be built by the whole community, but it requires participation of the whole community for it to succeed. So certainly the option that you talked about, one nation, one subscription, very much on the table, is going to be part of the policy together with many other measures in that direction. But again, you see, it's very, we are never talking about the issue which is cultural. We are thinking that there would be some solution out there which somehow, is going to work, right? You see, how it's going to work if people don't cooperate, right? So, we have started so many Indian journals. Time to time, people keep saying we should have an Indian journal. Who will publish in there? It's a lot like saying it's a great thing to become a soldier, but not my son, my neighbor's son. So I think this is very important that we talk candidly about these aspects. You are muted. Everybody.
Okay, yeah, this was Dr. S.K. Patrick's question. There is one more question, and can the Department of Science and Technology or the academies intersect and advise the Ministry of Education regarding laboratories in the schools?
I heard the last two words, laboratories in school.
Yeah. Can DST and the Science Academy intervene in the matter and advise the Ministry of Education?
Our scale is very limited. Yeah, no, certainly can. And something like the new policy we are putting up is called scientific social responsibility. It's not what it sounds. It is now. Can you please mute yourself, Dr. Nautiyal? Or I think there's some other speakers on.
Okay.
Great. Okay, thank you so very much. You see, yeah, I mean, right now, school, there's a lot of echo somewhere. There's some mic on, please mute. Of course, rest of our life goes talking about muting and muting. Okay, it's part of our life going forward. You see, the school, it is true that the lab education is totally missing from the school. Now, I was talking about scientific social responsibility, which is not as evil as it sounds. It is not about what research should be undertaken. It's only about connecting our science to society at large or different sections of society. It's not about appropriate research and all that. It's about, look, as a scientist, I have some information. As a scientist, I have some resources. How can I help people by doing a little bit, talking to MSMEs, talking to startups, talking to school children, talking to school principal, doing this, talking to farmer, all of that is kind of scientific social responsibility. But whole problem is while we do this, a lot of people are totally committed to doing it. Our scale is so limited that if you talk about 10 lakh schools across the country, 15 lakh schools across the country, and the resources that we have at our command, that we are very ill-equipped to do this. If it is not the Ministry of School Education or Department of School Education, if they are not able to do it, academy probably would have very little impact. I mean, it can have impact in terms of vision as to what needs to be done, but who is going to do it at what scale, that is not controlled by us.
Okay, I will. Any more questions you have? Not here.
Let me tell you, I had once chaired a
No, that's all.
I have a bit of mundane questions. One of the worries that I have is of a digital divide country is getting into, and only 10%. So what you are talking about, a very high-end industry 4.0 or industry 5.0, and then we have a digital divide, which will be about the 10% are web enabled. So number one is how the country proposes to handle this kind of digital divide, which is serious. And linked to that would be that it may be that after 20 years or 10 years, people may be asking for reservations in job because they suffered on account of the digital divide, number one. How do you handle the future of jobs? Because with artificial intelligence that you propose and machine learning, about 100 million jobs would be, or 10 million jobs, whatever numbers are, the 10 crore jobs will be reskilling. How do we handle that? The third question that I have is of, you can answer them together then. Third question that I have is of the fact that the industry in the south is growing. The numbers of education people in the north is going. So there is a southwards migration is going on. And that will have its own impact on the cultural, ecological scenarios. Are there any thoughts about it? And finally, do we have the data on our needs, which are realistic and pliable? Many more, but I'll stop at 4.
What is your answers to these 4 questions?
I'm asking you, sir. I have some answers, but not all of them. But I wanted to know your thinking in terms of STI policy. How will that address to? I don't have.
You see, our answers will never go very far unless we understand the scale and also the speed at which these things have to be done. Now, anyway, I have lost track of what was first, what was second, what was third. Fourth one, I still remember migration to south, right? Okay. Now, you see, it is true that we are talking about what you call the high end, the science and technology in terms of industry 4.0 or machine learning. But you see, it's not. Let's take one example. One of the very major problems we have in the country, our country, is the diversity of languages. Right now, we are all forced to speak in one tongue or other, which is mostly English in scientific community, isn't it? So how can we even think about democratizing any aspect of knowledge if we don't even have tools of language to convey it? And this is true of education. This is true of research. It's true of our even everyday business and conversation, right? And the reason that many of us are not as mobile as we should be is because of these problems. I'm not talking about that. Yeah, please mute yourselves. So, yeah, please mute yourselves. I think there's still some mics on. Okay. Yeah, I don't hear the echo. Good. So now think about, what would make it possible for people to communicate with each other, no matter what language they talk in. Imagine the impact this would have on our economy, but also integration and communication aspects. How would that be possible? It's not going to be possible by business as usual. It is going to be possible only by what we call this top technology, I mean, which looks a little exotic right now, is about machine translation. And this is going to happen. It's going to happen within the next 5 to 10 years, that real-time translation from any language to any language is going to happen. So now we'll not be confined like all of us sitting here. You can speak in Tamil, I can speak in Hindi, and we'll be totally on the same platform. This is a problem I looked into when I looked at Wikipedia. Now, a whole lot of people consult Wikipedia for all sorts of things today. The number of pages on science and technology in Wikipedia is the largest, and the highest represented language of India, Hindi, is about 100 times smaller, or even more, maybe 1,000 times smaller. So how are we going to do democratization of this knowledge if we cannot convert all this information which is in English into all the Indian languages? And this is a daunting task, the scale of which no academy can handle, unless we have perfected our tools of machine translation. And indeed, this is one big project I have given to a hub. This is one example, but all these examples basically mean That the problems, large-scale problems of society that we are talking about here, whether it is about access to not just information, but access to healthcare, it's not going to happen, right? The rate at which we are producing new doctors, for example, our problem would be solved in about 1,000 years from now. Okay, it is fairly clear that all the rural areas, the semi-urban areas, everything, they are not going to have specialized care and doctors unless you are able to, to press the tools of technology at their service. I'll give you an example because sometimes concrete examples help. These ventilators that we need for COVID-19. Now, there are new designs of ventilators, and it has happened even in India within 5 months, right? Which is a very heartening story that these ventilators have IoT and remote diagnosis and communication, which means that you don't need a dedicated doctor. Conventionally, this has to be monitored very closely by people who work in anesthesia. We don't have so many people. So one doctor can actually manage 10 patients remotely. In fact, it's being done already. The hub in Bangalore on cyber physical systems, they were actually assisting patients in Leh Ladakh, right? And this is going to pick up a scale. So what I'm saying is we have to find disruptive solutions to problems simply by saying that I will just do more of what I've been doing for the last 20 years is only going to, we can increase by 2% next year or 5%. Okay. This is what we call dhanda way of solving problems, not panga way of solving problems.
Anyway,
another point that you said, very important, you said reskilling would be required. You see, this has a very fundamental meaning, okay, because that fundamental meaning starts from the education. Now, all my education, I have believed, and all my students have ever believed that education is the content of education. Somehow we have actually transmitted the sense that when I'm teaching them education, I'm teaching them design of heat exchanger, let us say, that is education. Nothing could be farther from it, especially in the age of reskilling and relearning. Because you see, there were days when all the heat exchanger designs came and everything came, distillation column, when people had one job in their life. They joined one company and they retired from the same company and they did the same job for the rest of their life. Now, it is very clear that, of course, it's been clear to me all along because I always told people that whatever I'm teaching them, it has very little meaning in the way in which they are understanding that teaching. Their understanding of teaching is that they would design this heat exchanger and in the next exam they will do it and they will crack the exam. But when they have to really design a heat exchanger in life, nothing I have ever told them or taught them would be an iota useful. They would have to learn it from first principles. And this, it is the capacity to learn, it is the capacity to solve problems is the essence of education. It is not making this concrete, this cement, this something, whatever, right? It is just some very basic principles, and the rest of it is about relearning and changing all the time. And how do we convey that through our education?
yeah, I think we'll stop here because already we are beyond the time. And I know you are busy, and Vijay Raghavan is also online. He's almost busy.
Oh.
My thanks to all the four speakers, Professor Chandrima Saha, Professor Gordhan Mehta, Professor Vijay Raghavan, and Professor Sharma for 4 fascinating lectures. I know all of you have expected the academies to do more, much more than we have been doing, and I think Academy will not be found wanting in doing whatever it is. You are a part of the academies also. So kindly guide us through in taking the initiatives program, and I'm sure there are many people who are seriously interested in the future of the country. And with on that positive note, I will assure you that academies will do their best, both to Vijay and yourself and Professor Mehta. Of course, with time, some slackness may happen, but it will also change with time as the pressure comes in. And I'm sure you will find much more coming out of the academies than ever before. I thank you for your time and for sharing us, and I hope to see you again very soon sometimes. Thank you very much, and I request all of you to clap in front of your screen, Vijay and everybody. Thank you, Vijay, very much for being with us for all this time. Thank you, and let's actually clap for all the speakers for fantastic talk, and to an extent showing us the mirror. And I think it's a very valid mirror that you have shown us, and I think we need to be working harder and harder. There are, as was said by Professor C.N.R. Rao, there are no limits to excellence. We have to continue to excel. Thank you so much. Good night. Stay safe, and we'll see you tomorrow at 12.
May I just clarify one thing? There is no such thing as academy. It's all of us, right? So anything that we have said is only applicable to each one
Yes,
of
I
us.
agree.
Yeah, no criticism implied either for academy or somebody else, right?
I think I think what you said and what Vijay said and what Gordon Mehta said was all appropriate. We all realize, we are also thinking about it. And I don't think there was anything wrong in saying, because you are one, you are part of us, and that's what I mentioned, that you are part of us. And Vijay and I have been exchanging mails occasionally, and we hope to continue doing that. And we'll bring you back for more interaction, more discussion. Thank you so much.
Wonderful, wonderful.
Thank you. Thank you. And wonderful talks, Vijay. Wonderful talk, Dr. Raghavan. And wonderful talk, Professor Saha also. Thank you so much. And we'll meet tomorrow for a symposium being coordinated by Professor Partha Majumdar on the health and genomics. And we have 4 top experts from the world, one from Max Planck Institute in Leipzig, one from Finland, one from WHO. Partha Majumdar himself is an expert, and one Dr. Arindam Majumdar from his colleague, younger colleague. So you have a 3-hour symposium on human health and disease, the lessons from genomics, and they will cover the whole range from human migration and genomics to health to the issues of ethics. So I welcome and I request you all to join and really take part in the discussions. Today, first 3 lectures, we did not allow questions because these are presidential lecture and the award lectures. And who can ask questions to PSA anyway? So thank you so much and have a great evening. Thank you so much. And let's give one more hand break session. Bye, good night, and thanks, Dr. Sharma.